XXX. The fortune of the Republic. There is a mystery in the soul of state, which hath an operation more divine than breath or pen can give expression to. The fortune of the Republic. It is a rule that holds in economy as well as in hydraulics that you must have a source higher than your tap. The mills, the shops, the theater and the caucus, the college and the church, have all found out this secret. The sailors sail by chronometers that do not lose 2 or 3 seconds in a year, ever since Newton explained to Parliament that the way to improve navigation was to get good watches, and to offer public premiums for a better timekeeper than any then in use. The manufacturers rely on turbines of hydraulic perfection, the carpet mill, on mordants and dyes which exhaust the skill of the chemist, the calico print, on designers of genius who draw the wages of artists, not of artisans. Wedgwood, the eminent potter, bravely took the sculptor Flaxman to counsel, who said, "Send to Italy, search the museums for the forms of old Etruscan vases, urns, waterpots, domestic and sacrificial vessels of all kinds." They built great works and called their manufacturing village Etruria. Flaxman, with his Greek taste, selected and combined the loveliest forms, which were executed in English clay, sent boxes of these as gifts to every court of Europe, and formed the taste of the world. It was a renaissance of the breakfast table and china closet. The brave manufacturers made their fortune. The jewelers imitated the revived models in silver and gold. The theatre avails itself of the best talent of poet, of painter, and of amateur of taste, to make the ensemble of dramatic effect. The Marine Insurance Office has its mathematical counselor to settle averages, the life assurance, its table of annuities. The wine merchant has his analyst and taster, the more exquisite the better. He has also, I fear, his debts to the chemist as well as to the vineyard. Our modern wealth stands on a few staples, and the interest nations took in our war was exasperated by the importance of the cotton trade. And what is cotton? One plant out of some 200,000 known to the botanist, vastly the larger part of which are reckoned weeds. What is a weed? A plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered, every one of the 200,000 probably yet to be of utility in the arts. As Bacchus of the vine, Ceres of the wheat, as Arkwright and Whitney were the demigods of cotton, so prolific time will yet bring an inventor to every plant. There is not a property in nature but a mind is born to seek and find it. For it is not the plants or the animals, innumerable as they are, nor the whole magazine of material nature that can give the sum of power, but the infinite applicability of these things in the hands of thinking man. Every new application being equivalent to a new material. Our sleepy civilization, ever since Roger Bacon and Monk Schwartz invented gunpowder, has built its whole art of war, all fortification by land and sea, all drill and military education, on that one compound, all is an extension of a gun barrel. And is very scornful about bows and arrows, and reckons Greeks and Romans and Middle Ages little better than Indians and bow and arrow times. As if the earth, water, gases, lightning and caloric had not a million energies, the discovery of any one of which could change the art of war again, and put an end to war by the exterminating forces man can apply. Now, if this is true in all the useful and in the fine arts, that the direction must be drawn from a superior source or there will be no good work, does it hold less in our social and civil life? In our popular politics you may note that each aspirant who rises above the crowd, however at first making his obedient apprenticeship in party tactics, if he have sagacity, soon learns that it is by no means by obeying the vulgar weathercock of his party, the resentments, the fears and whims of it, that real power is gained, but that he must often face and resist the party, and abide by his resistance, and put them in fear. That the only title to their permanent respect, and to a larger following, is to see for himself what is the real public interest, and to stand for that. That is a principle, and all the cheering and hissing of the crowd must by and by accommodate itself to it. Our times easily afford you very good examples. The law of water and all fluids is true of wit. Prince Metternich said, "Revolutions begin in the best heads and run steadily down to the populace." It is a very old observation, not truer because Metternich said it, and not less true. There have been revolutions which were not in the interest of feudalism and barbarism, but in that of society. And these are distinguished not by the numbers of the combatants nor the numbers of the slain, but by the motive. No interest now attaches to the wars of York and Lancaster, to the wars of German, French and Spanish emperors, which were only dynastic wars, but to those in which a principle was involved. These are read with passionate interest and never lose their pathos by time. When the cannon is aimed by ideas, when men with religious convictions are behind it, when men die for what they live for, and the mainspring that works daily urges them to hazard all. Then the cannon articulates its explosions with the voice of a man, then the rifle seconds the cannon and the fowling piece the rifle, and the women make the cartridges, and all shoot at one mark. Then gods join in the combat, then poets are born, and the better code of laws at last records the victory. Now the culmination of these triumphs of humanity, and which did virtually include the extinction of slavery, is the planting of America. At every moment some one country more than any other represents the sentiment and the future of mankind. None will doubt that America occupies this place in the opinion of nations, as is proved by the fact of the vast immigration into this country from all the nations of Western and Central Europe. And when the adventurers have planted themselves and looked about, they send back all the money they can spare to bring their friends. Meantime they find this country just passing through a great crisis in its history, as necessary as lactation or dentition or puberty to the human individual. We are in these days settling for ourselves and our descendants questions which, as they shall be determined in one way or the other, will make the peace and prosperity or the calamity of the next ages. The questions of education, of society, of labor, the direction of talent, of character, the nature and habits of the American, may well occupy us, and more the question of religion. The new conditions of mankind in America are really favorable to progress, the removal of absurd restrictions and antique inequalities. The mind is always better the more it is used, and here it is kept in practice. The humblest is daily challenged to give his opinion on practical questions, and while civil and social freedom exists, nonsense even has a favorable effect. Cant is good to provoke common sense. The transmediums, the rebel paradoxes, exasperate the common sense. The wilder the paradox, the more sure is Punch to put it in the pillory. The lodging the power in the people, as in republican forms, has the effect of holding things closer to common sense. For a court or an aristocracy, which must always be a small minority, can more easily run into follies than a republic, which has too many observers, each with a vote in his hand, to allow its head to be turned by any kind of nonsense, since hunger, thirst, cold, the cries of children and debt are always holding the masses hard to the essential duties. 100 years ago the American people attempted to carry out the Bill of Political Rights to an almost ideal perfection. They have made great strides in that direction since. They are now proceeding, instructed by their success and by their many failures, to carry out, not the Bill of Rights, but the Bill of Human Duties. And look what revolution that attempt involves. Hitherto government has been that of the single person or of the aristocracy. In this country the attempt to resist these elements, it is asserted, must throw us into the government not quite of mobs, but in practice of an inferior class of professional politicians, who by means of newspapers and caucuses really thrust their unworthy minority into the place of the old aristocracy on the one side, and of the good, industrious, well-taught but unambitious population on the other. Win the posts of power and give their direction to affairs. Hence liberal congresses and legislatures ordain, to the surprise of the people, equivocal, interested and vicious measures. The men themselves are suspected and charged with lobbying and being lobbied. No measure is attempted for itself, but the opinion of the people is courted in the first place, and the measures are perfunctorily carried through as secondary. We do not choose our own candidate, no, nor any other man's first choice, but only the available candidate, whom, perhaps, no man loves. We do not speak what we think, but grope after the practicable and available. Instead of character, there is a studious exclusion of character. The people are feared and flattered. They are not reprimanded. The country is governed in barrooms, and in the mind of barrooms. The low can best win the low, and each aspirant for power vies with his rival which can stoop lowest, and depart widest from himself. The partisan on moral, even on religious questions, will choose a proven rogue who can answer the tests, over an honest, affectionate, noble gentleman, the partisan ceasing to be a man that he may be a sectarian. The spirit of our political economy is low and degrading. The precious metals are not so precious as they are esteemed. Man exists for his own sake, and not to add a laborer to the state. The spirit of our political action, for the most part, considers nothing less than the sacredness of man. Party sacrifices man to the measure. We have seen the great party of property and education in the country drivelling and huckstering away, for views of party fear or advantage, every principle of humanity and the dearest hopes of mankind. The trustees of power only energetic when mischief could be done, imbecile as corpses when evil was to be prevented. Our great men succumb so far to the forms of the day as to peril their integrity for the sake of adding to the weight of their personal character the authority of office, or making a real government titular. Our politics are full of adventurers, who having by education and social innocence a good repute in the state, break away from the law of honesty and think they can afford to join the devil's party. 'Tis odious, these offenders in high life. You rally to the support of old charities and the cause of literature, and there, to be sure, are these brazen faces. In this innocence you are puzzled how to meet them, must shake hands with them, under protest. We feel toward them as the minister about the Cape Cod farm, in the old time when the minister was still invited, in the spring, to make a prayer for the blessing of a piece of land, the good pastor being brought to the spot, stopped short. No. This land does not want a prayer, this land wants manure. 'Tis virtue which they want, and wanting it. Honor no garment to their backs can fit. Parties keep the old names, but exhibit a surprising fugacity in creeping out of one snakeskin into another of equal ignominy and lubricity, and the grasshopper on the turret of Faneuil Hall gives a proper hint of the men below. Everything yields. The very glaciers are viscous, or relegate into conformity, and the stiffest patriots falter and compromise, so that will cannot be depended on to save us. How rare are acts of will! We are all living according to custom. We do as other people do, and shrink from an act of our own. Every such act makes a man famous, and we can all count the few cases, half a dozen in our time, when a public man ventured to act as he thought without waiting for orders or for public opinion. John Quincy Adams was a man of an audacious independence that always kept the public curiosity alive in regard to what he might do. None could predict his word, and the whole Congress could not gainsay it when it was spoken. General Jackson was a man of will, and his phrase on one memorable occasion, "I will take the responsibility," is a proverb ever since. The American marches with a careless swagger to the height of power, very heedless of his own liberty or of other people's, in his reckless confidence that he can have all he wants, risking all the prized charters of the human race. Bought with battles and revolutions and religion, gambling them all away for a paltry selfish gain. He sits secure in the possession of his vast domain, rich beyond all experience and resources, sees its inevitable force unlocking itself in elemental order day by day, year by year. Looks from his coal fields, his wheat-bearing prairie, his gold mines, to his 2 oceans on either side, and feels the security that there can be no famine in a country reaching through so many latitudes, no want that cannot be supplied. No danger from any excess of importation of art or learning into a country of such native strength, such immense digestive power. In proportion to the personal ability of each man, he feels the invitation and career which the country opens to him. He is easily fed with wheat and game, with Ohio wine, but his brain is also pampered by finer drafts, by political power and by the power in the railroad board, in the mills, or the banks. This elevates his spirits, and gives, of course, an easy self-reliance that makes him self-willed and unscrupulous. I think this levity is a reaction on the people from the extraordinary advantages and invitations of their condition. When we are most disturbed by their rash and immoral voting, it is not malignity, but recklessness. They are careless of politics, because they do not entertain the possibility of being seriously caught in meshes of legislation. They feel strong and irresistible. They believe that what they have enacted they can repeal if they do not like it. But one may run a risk once too often. They stay away from the polls, saying that one vote can do no good. Or they take another step, and say one vote can do no harm, and vote for something which they do not approve, because their party or set votes for it. Of course this puts them in the power of any party having a steady interest to promote which does not conflict manifestly with the pecuniary interest of the voters. But if they should come to be interested in themselves and in their career, they would no more stay away from the election than from their own counting room or the house of their friend. The people are right-minded enough on ethical questions, but they must pay their debts, and must have the means of living well, and not pinching. So it is useless to rely on them to go to a meeting, or to give a vote, if any check from this must have the money side arises. If a customer looks grave at their newspaper, or damns their member of Congress, they take another newspaper, and vote for another man. They must have money, for a certain style of living fast becomes necessary. They must take wine at the hotel, first, for the look of it, and second, for the purpose of sending the bottle to 2 or 3 gentlemen at the table, and presently because they have got the taste, and do not feel that they have dined without it. The record of the election now and then alarms people by the all but unanimous choice of a rogue and a brawler. But how was it done? What lawless mob burst into the polls and threw in these hundreds of ballots in defiance of the magistrates? This was done by the very men you know, the mildest, most sensible, best-natured people. The only account of this is, that they have been scared or warped into some association in their mind of the candidate with the interest of their trade or of their property. Whilst each cabal urges its candidate, and at last brings, with cheers and street demonstrations, men whose names are a knell to all hope of progress, the good and wise are hidden in their active retirements, and are quite out of question. These we must join to wake, for these are of the strain. That justice dare defend, and will the age maintain. Yet we know, all over this country, men of integrity, capable of action and of affairs, with the deepest sympathy in all that concerns the public, mortified by the national disgrace, and quite capable of any sacrifice except of their honor. Faults in the working appear in our system, as in all, but they suggest their own remedies. After every practical mistake out of which any disaster grows, the people wake and correct it with energy. And any disturbances in politics, in civil or foreign wars, sober them, and instantly show more virtue and conviction in the popular vote. In each new thread of faction the ballot has been, beyond expectation, right and decisive. It is ever an inspiration, God only knows whence, a sudden, undated perception of eternal right coming into and correcting things that were wrong, a perception that passes through thousands as readily as through one. The gracious lesson taught by science to this country is that the history of nature from first to last is incessant advance from less to more, from rude to finer organization. The globe of matter thus conspiring with the principle of undying hope in man. Nature works in immense time, and spends individuals and races prodigally to prepare new individuals and races. The lower kinds are one after one extinguished, the higher forms come in. The history of civilization, or the refining of certain races to wonderful power of performance, is analogous, but the best civilization yet is only valuable as a ground of hope. Ours is the country of poor men. Here is practical democracy. Here is the human race poured out over the continent to do itself justice, all mankind in its shirt sleeves. Not grimacing like poor rich men in cities, pretending to be rich, but unmistakably taking off its coat to hard work, when labor is sure to pay. This through all the country. For really, though you see wealth in the capitals, it is only a sprinkling of rich men in the cities and at sparse points, the bulk of the population is poor. In Maine, nearly every man is a lumberer. In Massachusetts, every 12th man is a shoemaker, and the rest, millers, farmers, sailors, fishermen. Well, the result is, instead of the doleful experience of the European economist, who tells us, in almost all countries the condition of the great body of the people is poor and miserable, here that same great body has arrived at a sloven plenty. Ham and corn cakes, tight roof and coals enough have been attained. An unbuttoned comfort, not clean, not thoughtful, far from polished, without dignity in his repose. The man awkward and restless if he have not something to do, but honest and kind for the most part, understanding his own rights and stiff to maintain them, and disposed to give his children a better education than he received. The steady improvement of the public schools in the cities and the country enables the farmer or laborer to secure a precious primary education. It is rare to find a born American who cannot read and write. The facility with which clubs are formed by young men for discussion of social, political and intellectual topics secures the notoriety of the questions. Our institutions, of which the town is the unit, are all educational, for responsibility educates fast. The town meeting is, after the high school, a higher school. The legislature, to which every good farmer goes once on trial, is a superior academy. The result appears in the power of invention, the freedom of thinking, in the readiness for reforms, eagerness for novelty, even for all the follies of false science. In the antipathy to secret societies, in the predominance of the Democratic Party in the politics of the Union, and in the voice of the public even when irregular and vicious, the voice of mobs, the voice of lynch law, because it is thought to be, on the whole, the verdict, though badly spoken, of the greatest number. All this forwardness and self-reliance, cover self-government, proceed on the belief that as the people have made a government they can make another, that their union and law are not in their memory, but in their blood and condition. If they unmake a law, they can easily make a new one. In Mr. Webster's imagination the American Union was a huge Prince Rupert's drop, which will snap into atoms if so much as the smallest end be shivered off. Now the fact is quite different from this. The people are loyal, law-abiding. They prefer order, and have no taste for misrule and uproar. America was opened after the feudal mischief was spent, and so the people made a good start. We began well. No inquisition here, no kings, no nobles, no dominant church. Here heresy has lost its terrors. We have 8 or 10 religions in every large town, and the most that comes of it is a degree or 2 on the thermometer of fashion. A pew in a particular church gives an easier entrance to the subscription ball. We began with freedom, and are defended from shocks now for a century by the facility with which through popular assemblies every necessary measure of reform can instantly be carried. A Congress is a standing insurrection, and escapes the violence of accumulated grievance. As the globe keeps its identity by perpetual change, so our civil system, by perpetual appeal to the people and acceptance of its reforms. The government is acquainted with the opinions of all classes, knows the leading men in the middle class, knows the leaders of the humblest class. The president comes near enough to these. If he does not, the caucus does, the primary ward and town meeting, and what is important does reach him. The men, the women, all over this land shrill their exclamations of impatience and indignation at what is shortcoming or is unbecoming in the government, at the want of humanity, of morality, ever on broad grounds of general justice. And not on the class feeling which narrows the perception of English, French, German people at home. In this fact, that we are a nation of individuals, that we have a highly intellectual organization, that we can see and feel moral distinctions, and that on such an organization sooner or later the moral laws must tell, to such ears must speak. In this is our hope. For if the prosperity of this country has been merely the obedience of man to the guiding of nature, of great rivers and prairies, yet is there fate above fate, if we choose to spread this language. Or if there is fate in corn and cotton, so is there fate in thought, this, namely, that the largest thought and the widest love are born to victory, and must prevail. The revolution is the work of no man, but the eternal effervescence of nature. It never did not work. And we say that revolutions beat all the insurgents, be they never so determined and politic. That the great interests of mankind, being at every moment through ages in favor of justice and the largest liberty, will always, from time to time, gain on the adversary and at last win the day. Never country had such a fortune, as men call fortune, as this, in its geography, its history, and in its majestic possibilities. We have much to learn, much to correct, a great deal of lying vanity. The spread eagle must fold his foolish wings and be less of a peacock, must keep his wings to carry the thunderbolt when he is commanded. We must realize our rhetoric and our rituals. Our national flag is not affecting, as it should be, because it does not represent the population of the United States, but some Baltimore or Chicago or Cincinnati or Philadelphia caucus, not union or justice, but selfishness and cunning. If we never put on the liberty cap until we were freemen by love and self-denial, the liberty cap would mean something. I wish to see America not like the old powers of the earth, grasping, exclusive and narrow, but a benefactor such as no country ever was, hospitable to all nations, legislating for all nationalities. Nations were made to help each other as much as families were, and all advancement is by ideas, and not by brute force or mechanic force. In this country, with our practical understanding, there is, at present, a great sensualism, a headlong devotion to trade and to the conquest of the continent, to each man as large a share of the same as he can carve for himself. An extravagant confidence in our talent and activity, which becomes, whilst successful, a scornful materialism, but with the fault, of course, that it has no depth, no reserved force whereon to fall back when a reverse comes. That repose which is the ornament and ripeness of man is not American. That repose which indicates a faith in the laws of the universe, a faith that they will fulfill themselves, and are not to be impeded, transgressed or accelerated. Our people are too slight and vain. They are easily elated and easily depressed. See how fast they extend the fleeting fabric of their trade, not at all considering the remote reaction and bankruptcy, but with the same abandonment to the moment and the facts of the hour as the Eskimo who sells his bed in the morning. Our people act on the moment, and from external impulse. They all lean on some other, and this superstitiously, and not from insight of his merit. They follow a fact, they follow success, and not skill. Therefore, as soon as the success stops and the admirable man blunders, they quit him. Already they remember that they long ago suspected his judgment, and they transfer the repute of judgment to the next prosperous person who has not yet blundered. Of course this levity makes them as easily despond. It seems as if history gave no account of any society in which despondency came so readily to heart as we see it and feel it in ours. Young men at 30 and even earlier lose all spring and vivacity, and if they fail in their first enterprise throw up the game. The source of mischief is the extreme difficulty with which men are roused from the torpor of every day. Blessed is all that agitates the mass, breaks up this torpor, and begins motion. Corpora non agunt nisi soluta, the chemical rule is true in mind. Contrast, change, interruption, are necessary to new activity and new combinations. If a temperate wise man should look over our American society, I think the first danger that would excite his alarm would be the European influences on this country. We buy much of Europe that does not make us better men. And mainly the expensiveness which is ruining that country. We import trifles, dancers, singers, laces, books of patterns, modes, gloves and cologne, manuals of Gothic architecture, steam-made ornaments. America is provincial. It is an immense Halifax. See the secondariness and aping of foreign and English life, that runs through this country, in building, in dress, in eating, in books. Every village, every city, has its architecture, its costume, its hotel, its private house, its church, from England. Our politics threaten her. Her manners threaten us. Life is grown and growing so costly that it threatens to kill us. A man is coming, here as there, to value himself on what he can buy. Worst of all, his expense is not his own, but a far-off copy of Osborne House or the Élysée. The tendency of this is to make all men alike. To extinguish individualism and choke up all the channels of inspiration from God in man. We lose our invention and descend into imitation. A man no longer conducts his own life. It is manufactured for him. The tailor makes your dress. The baker your bread, the upholsterer, from an imported book of patterns, your furniture, the Bishop of London your faith. In the planters of this country, in the 17th century, the conditions of the country, combined with the impatience of arbitrary power which they brought from England, forced them to a wonderful personal independence and to a certain heroic planting and trading. Later this strength appeared in the solitudes of the West, where a man is made a hero by the varied emergencies of his lonely farm, and neighborhoods must combine against the Indians, or the horse thieves, or the river rowdies, by organizing themselves into committees of vigilance. Thus the land and sea educate the people, and bring out presence of mind, self-reliance, and hundred-handed activity. These are the people for an emergency. They are not to be surprised, and can find a way out of any peril. This rough and ready force becomes them, and makes them fit citizens and civilizers. But if we found them clinging to English traditions, which are graceful enough at home, as the English Church, and entailed estates, and distrust of popular election, we should feel this reactionary, and absurdly out of place. Let the passion for America cast out the passion for Europe. Here let there be what the earth waits for, exalted manhood. What this country longs for is personalities, grand persons, to counteract its materialities. For it is the rule of the universe that corn shall serve man, and not man corn. They who find America insipid, they for whom London and Paris have spoiled their own homes, can be spared to return to those cities. I not only see a career at home for more genius than we have, but for more than there is in the world. The class of which I speak make themselves merry without duties. They sit in decorated clubhouses in the cities, and burn tobacco and play whist. In the country they sit idle in stores and barrooms, and burn tobacco, and gossip and sleep. They complain of the flatness of American life. America has no illusions, no romance. They have no perception of its destiny. They are not Americans. The felon is the logical extreme of the epicure and coxcomb. Selfish luxury is the end of both, though in one it is decorated with refinements, and in the other brutal. But my point now is, that this spirit is not American. Our young men lack idealism. A man for success must not be pure idealist, then he will practically fail, but he must have ideas, must obey ideas, or he might as well be the horse he rides on. A man does not want to be sun-dazzled, sun-blind. But every man must have glimmer enough to keep him from knocking his head against the walls. And it is in the interest of civilization and good society and friendship, that I dread to hear of well-born, gifted and amiable men, that they have this indifference, disposing them to this despair. Of no use are the men who study to do exactly as was done before, who can never understand that today is a new day. There never was such a combination as this of ours, and the rules to meet it are not set down in any history. We want men of original perception and original action, who can open their eyes wider than to a nationality, namely, to considerations of benefit to the human race, can act in the interest of civilization. Men of elastic, men of moral mind, who can live in the moment and take a step forward. Columbus was no backward creeping crab, nor was Martin Luther, nor John Adams, nor Patrick Henry, nor Thomas Jefferson. And the genius or destiny of America is no log or sluggard, but a man incessantly advancing, as the shadow on the dial's face, or the heavenly body by whose light it is marked. The flowering of civilization is the finished man, the man of sense, of grace, of accomplishment, of social power, the gentleman. What hinders that he be born here? The new times need a new man, the complemental man, whom plainly this country must furnish. Freer swing his arms, farther pierce his eyes. More forward and forthright his whole build and rig than the Englishman's, who, we see, is much imprisoned in his backbone. 'Tis certain that our civilization is yet incomplete, it has not ended or given sign of ending in a hero. 'Tis a wild democracy, the riot of mediocrities and dishonesties and fudges. Ours is the age of the omnibus, of the third-person plural, of Tammany Hall. Is it that nature has only so much vital force, and must dilute it if it is to be multiplied into millions? The beautiful is never plentiful. Then Illinois and Indiana, with their spawning loins, must needs be ordinary. It is not a question whether we shall be a multitude of people. No, that has been conspicuously decided already. But whether we shall be the new nation, the guide and lawgiver of all nations, as having clearly chosen and firmly held the simplest and best rule of political society. Now, if the spirit which years ago armed this country against rebellion, and put forth such gigantic energy in the charity of the Sanitary Commission, could be waked to the conserving and creating duty of making the laws just and humane, it were to enroll a great constituency of religious, self-respecting, brave, tender, faithful obeyers of duty, lovers of men, filled with loyalty to each other, and with the simple and sublime purpose of carrying out in private and in public action the desire and need of mankind. Here is the post where the patriot should plant himself, here the altar where virtuous young men, those to whom friendship is the dearest covenant, should bind each other to loyalty. Where genius should kindle its fires and bring forgotten truth to the eyes of men. It is not possible to extricate yourself from the questions in which your age is involved. Let the good citizen perform the duties put on him here and now. It is not by heads reverted to the dying Demosthenes, or to Luther, or to Wallace, or to George Fox, or to George Washington, that you can combat the dangers and dragons that beset the United States at this time. I believe this cannot be accomplished by dunces or idlers, but requires docility, sympathy, and religious receiving from higher principles. For liberty, like religion, is a short and hasty fruit, and like all power subsists only by new rallyings on the source of inspiration. Power can be generous. The very grandeur of the means which offer themselves to us should suggest grandeur in the direction of our expenditure. If our mechanic arts are unsurpassed in usefulness, if we have taught the river to make shoes and nails and carpets, and the bolt of heaven to write our letters like a gilt pen, let these wonders work for honest humanity, for the poor, for justice, genius and the public good. Let us realize that this country, the last found, is the great charity of God to the human race. America should affirm and establish that in no instance shall the guns go in advance of the present right. We shall not make coups d'état and afterwards explain and pay, but shall proceed like William Penn, or whatever other Christian or humane person who treats with the Indian or the foreigner, on principles of honest trade and mutual advantage. We can see that the Constitution and the law in America must be written on ethical principles, so that the entire power of the spiritual world shall hold the citizen loyal, and repel the enemy as by force of nature. It should be mankind's Bill of Rights, or royal proclamation of the intellect ascending the throne, announcing its good pleasure that now, once for all, the world shall be governed by common sense and law of morals. The end of all political struggle is to establish morality as the basis of all legislation. 'Tis not free institutions, 'tis not a democracy that is the end, no, but only the means. Morality is the object of government. We want a state of things in which crime will not pay, a state of things which allows every man the largest liberty compatible with the liberty of every other man. Humanity asks that government shall not be ashamed to be tender and paternal, but that democratic institutions shall be more thoughtful for the interests of women, for the training of children, and for the welfare of sick and unable persons, and serious care of criminals, than was ever any the best government of the old world. The genius of the country has marked out our true policy, opportunity. Opportunity of civil rights, of education, of personal power, and not less of wealth, doors wide open. If I could have it, free trade with all the world without toll or custom houses, invitation as we now make to every nation, to every race and skin, white men, red men, yellow men, black men, hospitality of fair field and equal laws to all. Let them compete, and success to the strongest, the wisest and the best. The land is wide enough, the soil has bread for all. I hope America will come to have its pride in being a nation of servants, and not of the served. How can men have any other ambition where the reason has not suffered a disastrous eclipse? Whilst every man can say I serve, to the whole extent of my being I apply my faculty to the service of mankind in my especial place, he therein sees and shows a reason for his being in the world, and is not a moth or encumbrance in it. The distinction and end of a soundly constituted man is his labor. Use is inscribed on all his faculties. Use is the end to which he exists. As the tree exists for its fruit, so a man for his work. A fruitless plant, an idle animal, does not stand in the universe. They are all toiling, however secretly or slowly, in the province assigned them, and to a use in the economy of the world. The higher and more complex organizations to higher and more Catholic service. And man seems to play, by his instincts and activity, a certain part that even tells on the general face of the planet, drains swamps, leads rivers into dry countries for their irrigation, perforates forests and stony mountain chains with roads. Hinders the inroads of the sea on the continent, as if dressing the globe for happier races. On the whole, I know that the cosmic results will be the same, whatever the daily events may be. Happily we are under better guidance than of statesmen. Pennsylvania coal mines and New York shipping and free labor, though not idealists, gravitate in the ideal direction. Nothing less large than justice can keep them in good temper. Justice satisfies everybody, and justice alone. No monopoly must be foisted in, no weak party or nationality sacrificed, no coward compromise conceded to a strong partner. Every one of these is the seed of vice, war and national disorganization. It is our part to carry out to the last the ends of liberty and justice. We shall stand, then, for vast interests. North and South, East and West will be present to our minds, and our vote will be as if they voted, and we shall know that our vote secures the foundations of the state, goodwill, liberty and security of traffic and of production. And mutual increase of goodwill in the great interests. Our helm is given up to a better guidance than our own. The course of events is quite too strong for any helmsman, and our little wherry is taken in tow by the ship of the great admiral which knows the way, and has the force to draw men and states and planets to their good. Such and so potent is this high method by which the divine providence sends the chiefest benefits under the mask of calamities, that I do not think we shall by any perverse ingenuity prevent the blessing. In seeing this guidance of events, in seeing this felicity without example that has rested on the Union thus far, I find new confidence for the future. I could heartily wish that our will and endeavor were more active parties to the work. But I see in all directions the light breaking. Trade and government will not alone be the favored aims of mankind, but every useful, every elegant art, every exercise of the imagination, the height of reason, the noblest affection, the purest religion will find their home in our institutions. And write our laws for the benefit of men. Notes. The Lord's Supper. Mr. Emerson did not wish to have his sermons published. All that was worth saving in them, he said, would be found in the essays. Yet it seemed best, to Mr. Cabot and to Mr. Emerson's family, that this one sermon should be preserved. A record of a turning point in his life, it showed at once his thought and his character. For he not only gives the reasons why he believes the right not authoritatively enjoined, and hence recommends its modification or discontinuance, but with serenity and sweetness renders back his trust into his people's hands. Since he cannot see his way longer to exercise it as most of them desire. In the month of June, 1832, Mr. Emerson had proposed to the Church, apparently with hope of their approval, that the communion be observed only as a festival of commemoration, without the use of the elements. The committee to whom the proposal was referred made a report expressing confidence in him, but declining to advise the change, as the matter was one which they could not properly be called upon to decide. The question then came back to the pastor, whether he was willing to remain in his place and administer the rite in the usual form. He went alone to the White Mountains, then seldom visited, to consider the grave question whether he was prepared, rather than to continue the performance of a part of his priestly office from which his instincts and beliefs recoiled. To sacrifice a position of advantage for usefulness to his people to whom he was bound by many ties, and in preparation for which he had spent long years. He wrote, at Conway, New Hampshire, "Here among the mountains the pinions of thought should be strong, and one should see the errors of men from a calmer height of love and wisdom." His diary at Ethan Allen Crawford's contains his doubts and questionings, which Mr. Cabot has given in his memoir. Yet there was but one answer for him, and after a fortnight, he came back clear in his mind to give his decision, embodied in this sermon, to his people. On the same day that it was preached, he formally resigned his pastorate. The church was loath to part with him. It was hoped that some other arrangement might be made. Mr. Cabot learned that several meetings were held and the proprietors of pews were called in, as having an undoubted right to retain Mr. Emerson as their pastor, without reference to the opposition of the church. At length, after 2 adjournments and much discussion, it was decided by 30 votes against 24 to accept his resignation. It was voted at the same time to continue his salary for the present. Thus Mr. Emerson and his people parted in all kindness, but, as Mr. Cabot truly said, their difference of views on this right, was in truth only the symptom of a deeper difference which would in any case sooner or later have made it impossible for him to retain his office. A disagreement not so much about particular doctrines or observances as about their sanction, the authority on which all doctrines and observances rest. In the farewell letter which Mr. Emerson wrote to the people of his church, he said, "I rejoice to believe that my ceasing to exercise the pastoral office among you does not make any real change in our spiritual relation to each other. Whatever is most desirable and excellent therein remains to us. For, truly speaking, whoever provokes me to a good act or thought has given me a pledge of his fidelity to virtue, he has come under bonds to adhere to that cause to which we are jointly attached. And so I say to all you who have been my counselors and cooperators in our Christian walk, that I am wont to see in your faces the seals and certificates of our mutual obligations. If we have conspired from week to week in the sympathy and expression of devout sentiments, if we have received together the unspeakable gift of God's truth, if we have studied together the sense of any divine word, or striven together in any charity, or conferred together for the relief or instruction of any brother, if together we have laid down the dead in a pious hope, or held up the babe into the baptism of Christianity. Above all, if we have shared in any habitual acknowledgement of the benignant God, whose omnipresence raises and glorifies the meanest offices and the lowest ability, and opens heaven in every heart that worships him, then indeed we are united. We are mutually debtors to each other of faith and hope, engaged to persist and confirm each other's hearts in obedience to the gospel. We shall not feel that the nominal changes and little separations of this world can release us from the strong cordage of this spiritual bond. And I entreat you to consider how truly blessed will have been our connection if, in this manner, the memory of it shall serve to bind each one of us more strictly to the practice of our several duties. The doctrine of the offices of Jesus, even in the Unitarianism of Dr. Channing, was never congenial to Mr. Emerson's mind. He notes the same with regard to his father, and even to his Aunt Mary, in spite of her Calvinism. Any interposed personality between the Creator and the created was repugnant to him. Even in March, 1831, he is considering in his journal that his hearers will say, "To what purpose is this attempt to explain away so safe and holy a doctrine as that of the Holy Spirit? Why unsettle or disturb a faith which presents to many minds a helpful medium by which they approach the idea of God?" And he answers, "And this question I will meet. It is because I think the popular views of this principle are pernicious, because it does put a medium, because it removes the idea of God from the mind. It leaves some events, some things, some thoughts, out of the power of him who causes every event, every flower, every thought. The tremendous idea, as I may well call it, of God is screened from the soul. And least of all can we believe, reason will not let us, that the presiding Creator commands all matter and never descends into the secret chambers of the soul. There he is most present. The soul rules over matter. Matter may pass away like a mote in the sunbeam, may be absorbed into the immensity of God, as a mist is absorbed into the heat of the sun, but the soul is the kingdom of God, the abode of love, of truth, of virtue. In the hope of satisfying those of his people who held to the letter of the scriptural law, Mr. Emerson made the foregoing clear statement with regard to the authority for the right, from the professional point of view. It seems quite unlike his usual method, and there is little doubt that in it appears the influence of his elder brother, William, whose honest doubts had led him to abandon even earlier the profession of his fathers. In the introductory note to the chapter on Goethe, in Representative Men, is given an account of his unsuccessful pilgrimage to Weimar, in hopes that the great mind of Germany could solve these doubts. There is a letter still preserved, written by William, soon after his return, to his venerable kinsman at Concord, Dr. Ripley, in which he explains with great clearness his own reasons for not believing that the communion rite was enjoined by Jesus for perpetual observance. The argument on scriptural grounds there clearly stated is substantially the same as that which his younger brother makes use of in the beginning of this sermon. Thus far he has spoken of outward authority. From this point onward he speaks from within, the way native to him. Mr. Emerson left the struggles of the past behind, and did not care to recall them. Thus, writing of Lucretia Mott, whom he met when giving a course of lectures in Philadelphia, in January, 1843, he said, "Me she taxed with living out of the world. And I was not much flattered that her interest in me respected my rejection of an ordinance, sometime, somewhere. Also yesterday, for Philadelphian ideas, like love, do creep where they cannot go, I was challenged on the subject of the Lord's Supper, and with great slowness and pain was forced to recollect the grounds of my dissent in that particular. You may be sure I was very tardy with my texts." Mr. Emerson's journal during the period of trial and decision, in the mountains, shows that he was reading with great interest the life of George Fox. The simplicity of the Society of Friends, their aversion to forms and trust in the inward light, always appealed to him. In his essay on the preacher he says, "The supposed embarrassments to young clergymen exist only to feeble wills. That grey deacon, or respectable matron with Calvinistic antecedents, you can readily see, would not have presented any obstacle to the march of St. Bernard or of George Fox, of Luther or of Theodore Parker." This hints at the help he had found in the Quaker's history in his time of need. Historical Discourse at Concord. Mr. Emerson's discourse was printed soon after its delivery, and with it, in an appendix, the following notice of the celebration of the second centennial anniversary of the incorporation of the town. Sent to him by a friend who thought it desirable to preserve the remembrance of some particulars of this historical festival. At a meeting of the town of Concord, in April last, it was voted to celebrate the second centennial anniversary of the settlement of the town, on the September 12 following. A committee of 15 were chosen to make the arrangements. This committee appointed Ralph Waldo Emerson, orator, and Reverend Dr. Ripley and Reverend Mr. Wilder, chaplains of the day. Honorable John Keyes was chosen president of the day. On the morning of the September 12th, at 10:30 o'clock, the children of the town, to the number of about 500, moved in procession to the common in front of the old church and courthouse and there open to the right and left, awaiting the procession of citizens. At 11 o'clock, the Concord Light Infantry, under Captain Moore, and the artillery under Captain Buttrick, escorted the civic procession, under the direction of Moses Pritchard as chief marshal, from Shepherd's Hotel through the lines of children to the meeting house. The South Gallery had been reserved for ladies, and the North Gallery for the children. But, it was a good omen, the children overran the space assigned for their accommodation, and were sprinkled throughout the house, and ranged on seats along the aisles. The old meeting house, which was propped to sustain the unwonted weight of the multitude within its walls, was built in 1712, thus having stood for more than half the period to which our history goes back. Prayers were offered and the scriptures read by the aged minister of the town, Reverend Ezra Ripley, now in the 85th year of his age, another interesting feature in this scene of reminiscences. A very pleasant and impressive part of the services in the church was the singing of the 107th Psalm, from the New England version of the Psalms made by Eliot, Mather, and others, in 1639. And used in the church in this town in the days of Peter Bulkeley. The psalm was read a line at a time, after the ancient fashion, from the deacon's seat, and so sung to the tune of St. Martin's by the whole congregation standing. 10 of the surviving veterans who were in arms at the bridge, on the April 19, 1775, honored the festival with their presence. Their names are Abel Davis, Thaddeus Blood, Tilly Buttrick, John Hosmer, of Concord, Thomas Thorpe, Solomon Smith, John Oliver, Aaron Jones, of Acton, David Lane, of Bedford, Amos Baker, of Lincoln. On leaving the church, the procession again formed, and moved to a large tent nearly opposite Shepherd's Hotel, under which dinner was prepared, and the company sat down to the tables, to the number of 400. We were honored with the presence of distinguished guests, among whom were Lieutenant Governor Armstrong, Judge Davis, Alden Bradford, descended from the 2D Governor of Plymouth Colony, Honorable Edward Everett, Honorable Stephen C. Phillips of Salem, Philip Hone, Esq., of New York, General Dearborn, and Lieutenant Colonel R. C. Winthrop, descended from the first Governor of Massachusetts. Letters were read from several gentlemen expressing their regret at being deprived of the pleasure of being present on the occasion. The character of the speeches and sentiments at the dinner were manly and affectionate, in keeping with the whole temper of the day. On leaving the dinner table, the invited guests, with many of the citizens, repaired to the courthouse to pay their respects to the ladies of Concord, who had there, with their friends, partaken of an elegant collation, and now politely offered coffee to the gentlemen. The hall, in which the collation was spread, had been decorated by fair hands with festoons of flowers, and wreaths of evergreen, and hung with pictures of the fathers of the town. Crowded as it was with graceful forms and happy faces, and resounding with the hum of animated conversation, it was itself a beautiful living picture. Compared with the poverty and savageness of the scene which the same spot presented 200 years ago, it was a brilliant reverse of the medal, and could scarcely fail, like all the parts of the holiday, to lead the reflecting mind to thoughts of that divine providence, which, in every generation, has been our tower of defense and horn of blessing. At sunset the company separated and retired to their homes, and the evening of this day of excitement was as quiet as a Sabbath throughout the village. Within the year, Mr. Emerson had come to make his home for life in the ancestral town, and had become a householder. 2 days after the festival, he drove to Plymouth in a chaise, and was there married to Lydian Jackson, and immediately brought his bride to her Concord home. His aged step-grandfather was the senior chaplain at the celebration, and his brother Charles, who was to live with him in the new home, was one of the marshals. In preparation for this address Mr. Emerson made diligent examination of the old town records, and spent a fortnight in Cambridge consulting the works on early New England in the college library. I reproduce most of his references to his authorities exactly, although there are, no doubt, newer editions of some of the works. This story is from Bede's Ecclesiastical History, Chapter 13, Bond's Antiquarian Library. Mr. Emerson used it in full as the exordium of his essay on immortality, in Letters and Social Aims. The poem Hamatria, wherein appear the names of many of these first settlers, might well be read in connection with the opening passages of this address. Mr. Emerson's right of descent to speak as representative of Peter Bulkeley, who was the spiritual arm of the settlement, as Simon Willard was its sword arm, may here be shown. Rev. Joseph Emerson of Mendon, son of Thomas of Ipswich, the first of the name in this country, married Elizabeth, daughter of Reverend Edward Bulkeley, who succeeded his father, the Reverend Peter Bulkeley, as minister of Concord. Edward, the son of Joseph of Mendon and Elizabeth Bulkeley, was father of Reverend Joseph Emerson of Malden, who was father of Reverend William Emerson of Concord, who was father of Rev. William Emerson of Harvard and Boston, the father of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Neal's History of New England, Volume 1, page 132. Neal, Volume 1, page 321. Shattuck's History of Concord, page 158. On September 2, 1635, the General Court passed this order. It is ordered that there shall be a Plantacon att Musketaquid and that there shall be 6 miles of land square to belong to it, and that the inhabitants thereof shall have 3 years' immunities from all publ charges except trainings. Further, that when any that plant there shall have Ocacon of carrying of goods thither, they shall repair to 2 of the next magistrates where the teams are, who shall have the power for a year to praise a drafts, att reasonable rates, to be paid by the owners of the goods, to transport their goods thither att seasonable times, and the name of the place is changed and hereafter to be called Concord. Shattuck, page 5. In his lecture on Boston, published in the volume Natural History of Intellect, Mr. Emerson gives an amusing enumeration of some troubles which seemed so great to the newcomers from the Old World, he mentions their fear of lions, the accident to John Smith from The Most Poisonous Tale of a Fish Called a Stingray, the circumstance of the overpowering effect of the sweet fern upon the Concord party, and the intoxicating effect of wild grapes eaten by the Norse explorers, and adds, nature has never again indulged in these exasperations. It seems to have been the last outrage ever committed by the stingrays, or by the sweet fern, or by the fox grapes. They have been of peaceable behavior ever since. Johnson's Wonder-Working Providence, Chapter 35. Mr. Emerson abridged and slightly altered some sentences. Mort, Beginning of Plymouth, 1621, page 60. Johnson, page 56. Jocelyn, in his New England's Rarities Discovered, speaks with respect of squashes, but more truly squatter squashes. A kind of melon, or rather gourd, some of these are green, some yellow, some longish like a gourd, others round, like an apple, all of them pleasant food, boiled and buttered, and seasoned with spice. But the yellow squash, called an apple squash, because like an apple, and about the bigness of a pome water is the best kind. Wood, in his New England Prospect, says, in summer, when their corn is spent, squashes is their best bread, a fruit much like a pumpkin. Nashotuck, a small and shapely hill between the Musketaquid and the Assabet streams, at their point of union, was a pleasant and convenient headquarters for a sagamore of a race whose best roadway for travel and transportation was a deep, quiet stream, the fish of which they ate, and also used for manure for their cornfields along the bluffs. Indian graves have been found on this hill. Jocelyn's Voyages to New England, 1638. Hutchinson's History of Massachusetts, Volume 1, Chapter 6. Thomas Morton, New England Canaan, page 47. Shattuck, page 6. The old Middlesex Hotel, which stood during the greater part of the 19th century on the southwest side of the Common, opposite the court and town houses, had fallen into decay in 1900. And was bought and taken down by the town as an improvement to the public square to commemorate the 125th anniversary of Concord fight. It is probable that Jethro's Oak, under which the treaty was made, stood a little nearer the house of Reverend Peter Bulkeley, the site of which, about 100 paces distant on the Lowell Road, is now marked by a stone and bronze tablet. Depositions taken in 1684, and copied in the first volume of the Town Records. Johnson's Wonder-Working Providence. New England's Plantation. E. W.S. Letter in Mort, 1621. Peter Bulkeley's Gospel Covenant. Preached at Concord in New England. 2d edition, London, 1651, page 432. See petition in Shattuck's History, page 14. Shattuck, page 14. This was the meadow and upland on the Lowell Road, 1 mile north of Concord, just beyond the river. On the farm stands the unpainted lean-to house, now owned by the daughters of the late Edmund Hosmer. Concord Town Records. Bancroft, History of the United States, Volume 1, page 389. Savage's Winthrop, Volume 1, page 114. Colony Records, Volume 1. C. Hutchinson's Collection, page 287. Winthrop's Journal, Volume 1, pages 128, 129, and the editor's note. Winthrop's Journal, Volume 2, page 160. Town Records. With the exception of the anecdotes in this and the following sentence, almost the whole of this account of the theory and practice of the New England town meeting was used by Mr. Emerson in his oration, given in December, 1870, before the New England Society in New York. The greater part of the matter used in that address is included in the lecture on Boston, in the volume Natural History of Intellect. The New England Society of New York recently published the orations delivered before it previous to 1871, including Mr. Emerson's, as far as it could be recovered from the scattered manuscript, and the newspaper reports of the time. Hutchinson's Collection, page 27. Shattuck, page 20. The Government, November 13. 1644, ordered the county courts to take care of the Indians residing within their several shires, to have them civilized, and to take order, from time to time, to have them instructed in the knowledge of God. Shepherd's Clear Sunshine of the Gospel, London, 1648. These rules are given in Shattuck's History, pp. 22-24, and were called Conclusions and Orders made and agreed upon by divers sachems and other principal men amongst the Indians at Concord in the end of the 11th month, called January, and 1646. The following are interesting specimens of these. Rule 2. That there shall be no more powwowing amongst the Indians. And if any shall hereafter powwow, both he that shall powwow, and he that shall procure him to powwow, shall pay 20 shillings apiece. Rule 4. They desire they may understand the wiles of Satan, and grow out of love with his suggestions and temptations. Rule 5. That they may fall upon some better course to improve their time than formerly. Rule 15. They will wear their hair comely, as the English do, and whosoever shall offend herein shall pay 4 shillings. Rule 23. They shall not disguise themselves in their mournings as formerly, nor shall they keep a great noise by howling. Rule 24. The old ceremony of a maid walking alone and living apart so many days, fine, 20 shillings. Shepherd, page 9. Wilson's Letter, 1651. News from America, page 22. Winthrop, Volume 2, page 2. Hutchinson, Volume 1, page 90. Hutchinson, Volume 1, page 112. Winthrop, Volume 2, page 21. Hutchinson, Volume 1, page 94. Bulkeley's Gospel Covenant, page 209. Winthrop, Volume 2, page 94. Gospel Covenant, page 301. Shattuck, page 45. Hutchinson, Volume 1, page 172. See his instructions from the commissioners, his narrative, and the commissioner's letter to him, in Hutchinson's collection, pages 261-270. Hutchinson's History, Volume 1, page 254. Hubbard's Indian Wars, page 119, edition 1801. Mr. Charles H. Walcott, in his Concord in the Colonial Period, Estes and Laureate, Boston, 1884, gives a very interesting account of the Brookfield fight. Hubbard, page 201. Hubbard, page 185. Hubbard, page 245. Shattuck, page 55. Hubbard, page 260. Neal's History of New England, Volume 1, page 321. Mather, Magnalia Christi, Volume 1, page 363. Tradition has handed down the following anecdote. A consultation among the Indian chiefs took place about this time on the high lands in Stowe, and, as they cast their eyes towards Sudbury and Concord, a question arose which they should attack first. The decision was made to attack the former. One of the principal chiefs said, "We no prosper if we go to Concord, the Great Spirit love that people, the evil spirit tell us not to go, they have a great man there, he great pray." The Rev. Edward Bulkeley was then minister of the town, and his name and distinguished character were known even to the red men of the forest. Shattuck's History, page 59, note. On this occasion the name of Hoare, since honored in Concord through several generations, came to the front. John Hoare, the first practitioner of law in Concord, an outspoken man of sturdy independence, who, for uttering complaints that justice was denied him in the courts, had been made to give bonds for good behavior and disabled to plead any cases but his own in this jurisdiction, who had been fined £10 for saying that the blessing which his master Bulkeley pronounced in dismissing the public assembly was no more than vain babbling, and was twice fined for non-attendance at public worship, proved to be the only man in town who was willing to take charge of the praying Indians of Neshoba, whom the General Court ordered moved to Concord during Philip's War. The magistrates who had persecuted him had to turn to him, and he made good provision on his own place for the comfort and safe keeping of these unfortunates, and their employment. when public opinion was directed against them with the cruelty of fear. Soon, however, Captain Moseley, who had been secretly sent for by some citizens, came with soldiers into the meeting-house, announced to the congregation that he had heard that there were some heathen in town committed to one whore, who, he was informed, were a trouble and disquiet to them. Therefore, if the people desired it, he would remove them to Boston. No one made objection, so he went to Mr. Whore's house, counted the Indians and set a guard, Whore vigorously protesting. He came next day. Whore bravely refused to give them up, so Moseley removed them by violence and carried the Indians to Deer Island, where they suffered much during the winter. See Walcott's Concord in the Colonial Period. Sprague Centennial Ode. Shattuck, Chap. 3, Walcott, Chapter 3. Hutchinson's Collection, page 484. Hutchinson's Collection, pages 543, 548, 557, 566. Hutchinson's History, Volume 1, page 336. The month of April has been fateful for Concord, especially its 19th day. On that day the military company under Lieutenant Heald marched to Boston to take part in the uprising of the freemen of the colony against Andros. On that same day, in 1775, the Minutemen and militia of Concord, promptly reinforced by the soldiers of her daughter and sister towns, marched down to the guarded North Bridge and returned the fire of the royal troops in the opening battle of the Revolution. Again on the 19th of April, 1861, the Concord Artillery, so-called, although then a company of the 5th Infantry, MVM, left the village for the front in the War of the Rebellion. And yet again in the last days of April, 1898, the same company, then, as now, attached to the 6th Regiment, MVM, marched from the village green to bear its part in the Spanish War. Town Records. The following minutes from the Town Records in 1692 may serve as an example. John Craggan, aged about 63 years, and Sarah his wife, A.E.T. about 63 years, do both testify upon oath that about 2 years ago John Shepherd, sen. of Concord, came to our house in Aborn, to treat with us, and give us a visit, and carried the said Sary Craggan to Concord with him, and there discoursed us in order to a marriage between his son, John Shepherd, June and our daughter, Elise Craggan, and, for our encouragement, and before us, did promise that, upon the consummation of the said marriage, he, the said John Shepherd, senator would give to his son, John Shepherd, June, the one half of his dwelling house, and the old barn, and the pasture before the barn, the old plowland, and the old horse, when his colt was fit to ride, and his old oxen, when his steers were fit to work. All this he promised upon marriage as above said, which marriage was consummated upon March following, which is 2 years ago, come next March. Dated February 25, 1692. Taken on oath before me. William Johnson. Town Records, July, 1698. Records, November 1711. Records, May, 1712. Records, 1735. Whitfield in his journal wrote, "About noon I reached Concord. Here I preached to some thousands in the open air, and comfortable preaching it was. The hearers were sweetly melted down. The minister of the town being, I believe, a true child of God, I chose to stay all night at his house that we might rejoice together. The Lord was with us. The Spirit of the Lord came upon me and God gave me to wrestle with him for my friends, especially those then with me. Brother B. S., the minister, broke into floods of tears, and we had reason to cry out it was good for us to be here." Church Records, July, 1792. The Reverend Daniel Bliss has left the name of having been an earnest, good man, evidently emotional. His zealous and impassioned preaching gave offense to some of the cooler and more conservative clergy, and indeed bred discord in the Church of Concord. The aggrieved brethren withdrew, and, for want of a church, held public worship at a tavern where was the sign of a black horse, hence were called the Black Horse Church. Their complaints preferred against Mr. Bliss resulted in councils which drew in most of the churches of Middlesex into their widening vortex. Yet he remained the honored pastor of the town until his death. His daughter Phoebe married the young William Emerson, his successor. He was therefore Mr. Emerson's great-grandfather. Town Records. Town Records. Town Records. The spirited protest of this county convention, presided over by Honorable James Prescott of Groton, is given in full in Shattuck's History, pages 82 to 87. General Gage, the governor, having refused to convene the General Court at Salem, the Provincial Congress of Delegates from the towns of Massachusetts was called by conventions of the various counties to meet at Concord, October 11, 1774. The delegates assembled in the meeting house, and organized, with John Hancock as president, and Benjamin Lincoln as secretary. Called together to maintain the rights of the people, this Congress assumed the government of the province, and by its measures prepared the way for the Revolution. This eloquent sermon to the volunteers of 1775, still preserved in MS. is very interesting. The young minister shows them the dignity of their calling, warns them of the besetting sins of New England soldiery, explains to them the invasion of their rights and that they are not rebels. Tells them that he believes their fathers foresaw the evil day and did all in their power to guard the infant state from encroachments of unconstitutional power, and implores the sons to be true to their duty to their posterity. He fully admits the utter gloom of the prospect. Humanly considered, would heaven hold him innocent, he would counsel submission, but as an honest man and servant of heaven he dare not do so, and with great spirit bids his injured countrymen arise and plead even with the sword, the firelock and the bayonet, the birthright of Englishmen, and if God does not help, it will be because your sins testify against you, otherwise you may be assured. Journal, July, 1835. It is affecting to see the old man's, Thaddeus Blood, memory taxed for facts occurring 60 years ago at Concord fight. It is hard to bring them up, he says, the truth never will be known. The doctor, Ripley, like a keen hunter, unrelenting, follows him up and down, barricading him with questions. Yet cares little for the facts the man can tell, but much for the confirmation of the printed history. Leave me to repose. Thaddeus Blood, who was only 20 years old at the time of Concord fight, later became a schoolmaster, hence was always known as Master Blood. He was one of the Concord Company stationed at Hull, in 1776, which took part in the capture of Lieutenant Colonel Campbell and his battalion of the 71st, Fraser, Highlanders as they sailed into Boston Harbor. Not being aware of the evacuation of the town, they were confined at Concord until their exchange. See Sir Archibald Campbell of Inverneil, sometime prisoner of war in the jail at Concord, Massachusetts. By Charles H. Walcott, Boston, 1898. In his poem in memory of his brother Edward, written by the riverside near the battleground, Mr. Emerson alluded to yon stern headstone, which more of pride than pity gave, to mark the Briton's friendless grave. Yet it is a stately tomb. The grand return of eve and morn, the year's fresh bloom, the silver cloud, might grace the dust that is most proud. Captain Miles commanded the Concord Company that joined the Northern Army at Ticonderoga in August, 1776, as part of Colonel Reed's regiment. Judge John S. Keyes, who clearly remembers the incidents of this celebration, seen from a boy's coign of vantage, the top of one of the inner doors of the church, tells me that the 10 aged survivors of the battle, who sat in front of the pulpit, bowed in recognition of this compliment by the orator, and then the audience all bowed to them. The sanctity of the church forbade in those days cheering or applause even at a civic festival. The following was Mr. Emerson's note concerning his authorities. The importance which the skirmish at Concord Bridge derived from subsequent events, has, of late years, attracted much notice to the incidents of the day. There are, as might be expected, some discrepancies in the different narratives of the fight. In the brief summary in the text, I have relied mainly on the depositions taken by order of the Provincial Congress within a few days after the action, and on the other contemporary evidence. I have consulted the English narrative in the Massachusetts Historical Collections, and in the Trial of Horne, Cases Adjudged in King's Bench, London, 1800, Volume 2, page 677. The inscription made by order of the Legislature of Massachusetts on the 2 field pieces presented to the Concord Artillery, Mr. Finney's History of the Battle at Lexington, Dr. Ripley's History of Concord Fight, Mr. Shattuck's narrative in his history, besides some oral and some manuscript evidence of eyewitnesses. The following narrative, written by Reverend William Emerson, a spectator of the action, has never been published. A part of it has been in my possession for years, a part of it I discovered, only a few days since, in a trunk of family papers. 1775, April 19th. This morning, between 1 and 2 o'clock, we were alarmed by the ringing of the bell, and upon examination found that the troops, to the number of 800, had stole their march from Boston, in boats and barges. From the bottom of the common over to a point in Cambridge, near to Inman's Farm, and were at Lexington Meeting House, half an hour before sunrise, where they had fired upon a body of our men, and, as we afterward heard, had killed several. This intelligence was brought us at first by Dr. Samuel Prescott, who narrowly escaped the guard that were sent before on horses, purposely to prevent all posts and messengers from giving us timely information. He, by the help of a very fleet horse, crossing several walls and fences, arrived at Concord at the time above mentioned. When several posts were immediately dispatched, that returning confirmed the account of the regulars' arrival at Lexington, and that they were on their way to Concord. Upon this, a number of our minutemen belonging to this town, and Acton, and Lincoln, with several others that were in readiness, marched out to meet them, while the alarm company were preparing to receive them in the town. Captain Minot, who commanded them, thought it proper to take possession of the hill above the meeting house, as the most advantageous situation. No sooner had our men gained it, than we were met by the companies that were sent out to meet the troops, who informed us, that they were just upon us, and that we must retreat, as their number was more than treble ours. We then retreated from the hill near the Liberty Pole, and took a new post back of the town upon an eminence, where we formed into 2 battalions, and waited the arrival of the enemy. Scarcely had we formed, before we saw the British troops at the distance of a quarter of a mile, glittering in arms, advancing towards us with the greatest celerity. Some were for making a stand, notwithstanding the superiority of their number. But others more prudent thought best to retreat till our strength should be equal to the enemy's by recruits from neighboring towns that were continually coming in to our assistance. Accordingly we retreated over the bridge, when the troops came into the town, set fire to several carriages for the artillery, destroyed 60 BBLS. Flour, rifled several houses, took possession of the town house, destroyed 500 pounds. Of balls, set a guard of 100 men at the North Bridge, and sent up a party to the house of Colonel Barrett, where they were in expectation of finding a quantity of warlike stores. But these were happily secured, just before their arrival, by transportation into the woods and other byplaces. In the meantime, the guards set by the enemy to secure the pass at the North Bridge were alarmed by the approach of our people, who had retreated, as mentioned before, and were now advancing with special orders not to fire upon the troops unless fired upon. These orders were so punctually observed that we received the fire of the enemy in 3 several and separate discharges of their pieces before it was returned by our commanding officer. The firing then soon became general for several minutes, in which skirmish 2 were killed on each side, and several of the enemy wounded. It may here be observed, by the way, that we were the more cautious to prevent beginning a rupture with the King's troops, as we were then uncertain what had happened at Lexington, and knew not that they had began the quarrel there by first firing upon our people, and killing 8 men upon the spot. The 3 companies of troops soon quitted their post at the bridge, and retreated in the greatest disorder and confusion to the main body, who were soon upon the march to meet them. For half an hour, the enemy, by their marches and countermarches, discovered great fickleness and inconstancy of mind, sometimes advancing, sometimes returning to their former posts. Till, at length they quitted the town, and retreated by the way they came. In the meantime, a party of our men, 150, took the back way through the great fields into the east quarter, and had placed themselves to advantage, lying in ambush behind walls, fences, and buildings, ready to fire upon the enemy on their retreat. 50 years after his death the town erected a cenotaph to the memory of its brave young minister, whose body lies by the shore of Otter Creek, near Rutland, Vermont. On it they wrote, "Enthusiastic, eloquent, affectionate and pious, he loved his family, his people, his God and his country, and to this last he yielded the cheerful sacrifice of his life." Town Records, December 1775. These facts are recorded by Shattuck in his History. Bradford's History of Massachusetts, Volume 2, page 113. Shattuck. Town Records, May 3, 1782. Town Records, September 9, and Bradford's History, Volume 1, page 266. The Rev. Grindal Reynolds, late pastor of the First Church in Concord, wrote an interesting account of Shays's rebellion, and various papers concerning his adopted town which are included in his historical and other papers. Published by his daughter in 1895. Town Records, October 21. Town Records, May 7. Town Records, 1834 and 1835. In 1903-4 the town, with a population of about 5,000, appropriated for public purposes $65,752, the amount for school purposes being $28,000. The Unitarian and the Orthodox, as the Trinitarian Congregationalist Society has always been called in Concord, churches have for a century been good neighbors, and for many years have held union meetings on Thanksgiving Day. At the time of Mr. Emerson's discourse it is doubtful if Concord contained a single Catholic or Episcopalian believer. The beginning of the 20th century finds a larger body of Catholic worshippers than the 4 other societies contain. Yet all live in charity with one another. Mr. Emerson's honored kinsman, Rev. Ezra Ripley, who sat in the pulpit that day, was 84 years old, and when, 6 years later, he died, he had been pastor of the Concord Church for 63 years. Lemuel Shattuck, author of the excellent History of Concord, which was published before the end of the year. In Mr. Emerson's lecturing excursions during the following 35 years, he found with pleasure and pride the sons of his Concord neighbors important men in the building up the prairie and river towns, or the making and operating the great highways of emigration and trade. Letter to President Van Buren. April 19, 1838, Mr. Emerson made this entry in his journal. "This disaster of the Cherokees, brought to me by a sad friend to blacken my days and nights. I can do nothing, why shriek? Why strike ineffectual blows? I stir in it for the sad reason that no other mortal will move, and if I do not, why, it is left undone. The amount of it, to be sure, is merely a scream, but sometimes a scream is better than a thesis. Yesterday wrote the letter to Van Buren, a letter hated of me, a deliverance that does not deliver the soul. I write my journal, I read my lecture with joy, but this stirring in the philanthropic mud gives me no peace. I will let the Republic alone until the Republic comes to me. I fully sympathize, be sure, with the sentiments I write, but I accept it rather from my friends than dictate it. It is not my impulse to say it, and therefore my genius deserts me. No muse befriends, no music of thought or word accompanies. Yet his conscience then, and many a time later, brought him to do the brave, distasteful duty. Address on Emancipation in the British West Indies. The 10th anniversary of the emancipation by Act of Parliament of all slaves in the insular possessions of Great Britain in the West Indies was celebrated in Concord, in the year 1844. By citizens of 13 Massachusetts towns, and they invited Mr. Emerson to make the address. The Reverend Dr. Channing, on whose mind the wrongs of the slave had weighed ever since he had seen them in Santa Cruz, had spoken on slavery in Faneuil Hall in 1837, had written on the subject. And his last public work had been a speech on the anniversary of the West Indian emancipation in 1842, in the village of Lenox. The public conscience was slowly becoming aroused, especially among the country people, who had not the mercantile and social relations with the Southerner which hampered the action of many people in the cities. Yet even in Concord the religious societies appear to have closed their doors against the philanthropists who gathered to celebrate this anniversary in 1844, but the energy of the young Thoreau, always a champion of freedom, secured the use of the courthouse, and he himself rang the bell to call the people together. It is said that Mr. Emerson, while minister of the Second Church in Boston, had held his pulpit open to speakers on behalf of liberty, and to his attitude in 1835 Harriet Martineau bears witness in her autobiography. After speaking of the temperamental unfitness of these brother scholars, Charles and Waldo, to become active workers in an abolitionist organization, she says, "Yet they did that which made me feel that I knew them through the very cause in which they did not implicate themselves." At the time of the hubbub against me in Boston, Charles Emerson stood alone in a large company and declared that he would rather see Boston in ashes than that I or anybody should be debarred in any way from perfectly free speech. His brother Waldo invited me to be his guest in the midst of my unpopularity, and during my visit told me his course about this matter of slavery. He did not see that there was any particular thing for him to do in it then. But when, in coaches or steamboats or anywhere else, he saw people of color ill-treated, or heard bad doctrine or sentiment propounded, he did what he could, and said what he thought. Since that date he has spoken more abundantly and boldly, the more critical the times became. And he is now, and has long been, identified with the abolitionists in conviction and sentiment, though it is out of his way to join himself to their organization. Mr. Cabot in his memoir gives several pages of extracts from Mr. Emerson's journal showing his feelings at this time, before the slave power, aggressive and advancing, left him, as a lover of freedom, no choice but to fight for her as he could, by tongue and pen, in seasons of peril. This address was printed in England, as well as in America, the autumn after its delivery here. In a letter to Carlyle written September 1, Mr. Emerson says he is sending proof to the London publisher. Chapman wrote to me by the last steamer, urging me to send him some manuscript that had not yet been published in America, hoping for copyright, and promising half profits. The request was so timely, since I was not only printing a book, but also a pamphlet, that I came to town yesterday and hastened the printers, and have now sent him proofs of all the address, and of more than half of the book. He requests Carlyle to have an eye to its correct reproduction, to which his friend faithfully attended. It was characteristic of Mr. Emerson that, as a corrective to the flush of righteous wrath that man should be capable of laying hands on another, to coin his labor and sweat, came his sense of justice, and the power of seeing the planter's side. Born into such a social and political condition, by breeding in climatic conditions unable to toil, and with his whole inheritance vested in slaves. In a speech in New York in 1855, Mr. Emerson urged emancipation with compensation to the owners, by general sacrifices to this great end by old and young throughout the North, not as the planters do, but as recognizing their need and losses. Yet with all due consideration for the planters' misfortune of condition, he said, on the main question, it is impossible to be a gentleman and not be an abolitionist. Sole estate his sire bequeathed. Hapless sire to hapless son, was the wailing song he breathed. And his chain when life was done. These lines from Voluntaries, in the poems, and the stanza which there follows them, are recalled by this passage. Granville Sharp, 1734–1813, was a broad-minded scholar and determined philanthropist. He left the study of law to go into the Ordnance Office, which he left, when the American Revolution came on, disapproving of the course of the government. In the case of one of the slaves whom he defended, the Lord Mayor discharged the Negro, but his master would not give him up. The case then went before the Court of King's Bench, and the 12 judges decided in 1772 that a man could not be held in, or transported from, England. In June, 1787, Sharp with Clarkson and 10 others, 9 of whom were Quakers, formed a committee for effecting the abolition of the slave trade. Sharp was chairman. Defeated in Parliament in 1788 and 1789, they were joined by Pitt and Fox in 1790. In 1793 the Commons passed an act for gradual abolition of the trade, which was rejected by the peers. This occurred again in 1795 and 1804. In 1806, the Fox and Grenville ministry brought forward abolition of the trade as a government measure. It was carried in 1807. Then the enemies of slavery began to strive for its gradual abolition throughout the British dominions, Clarkson, Wilberforce and Buxton being the principal leaders. The course of events, however, showed that immediate emancipation would be a better measure. The government brought this forward in 1823, modified by an apprenticeship system. The bill with this feature and some compensation to owners was passed in 1833. In the essay on self-reliance Mr. Emerson said, "An institution is the lengthened shadow of one man, as monachism, of the hermit Antony, the Reformation, of Luther. Quakerism, of Fox, Methodism, of Wesley, abolition, of Clarkson." The pre-ideals seem to have been the slaves born into captivity, as distinguished from imported slaves. Emancipation in the West Indies, a 6 months tour in Antigua, Barbados and Jamaica, in the year 1837. J. A. Tomey in J. H. Kimball, New York, 1838. This was very soon after the coronation of the young Queen Victoria, which occurred in the previous year. All things are moral, and in their boundless changes have an unceasing reference to spiritual nature. Therefore is nature glorious with form, color and motion, that every globe in the remotest heaven, every chemical change from the rudest crystal up to the laws of life, every animal function from the sponge up to Hercules, shall hint or thunder to man the laws of right and wrong, and echo the 10 Commandments. Nature, Addresses and Lectures, page 40. See also the last sentence in Prudence, Essays, first series. For he, a ruler, is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Epistle to the Romans, 13. 4. The cause for Mr. Emerson's indignation was great and recent. His honored townsman, Samuel Hoar, Esq., sent by the state of Massachusetts as her commissioner to South Carolina to investigate the seizures, imprisonments, punishments, and even sale of colored citizens of Massachusetts who had committed no crime, had been expelled with threats of violence from the city of Charleston. See Samuel Hoar, in Lectures and Biographical Sketches. A Union then of honest men. Or Union nevermore again. Boston, Poems. John Quincy Adams, who, though disapproving, as untimely, the legislation urged on Congress by the abolitionists, yet fought strongly and persistently against the rules framed to check their importunity, as inconsistent with the right of petition itself. Here comes in the doctrine of the survival of the fittest that appears in the Ode inscribed to W. H. Channing, but, even more than there, tempered by faith in the strength of humanity. See the Lecture on the Times, given in 1841, Nature, Addresses and Lectures, page 220, for considerations on slavery more coolly philosophical than Mr. Emerson's warm blood often admitted of, during the strife for liberty in the period between the Mexican and Civil Wars. Today unbind the captive. So only are ye unbound. Lift up a people from the dust. Trump of their rescue, sound. Boston Hymn, Poems. In the early version of the Boston poem were these lines. Oh pity that I pause. The song disdaining shuns to name the noble sires, because of the unworthy sons. Your town is full of gentle names. By patriots once were watchwords made. Those war-cry names are muffled shames. On recreant sons mislaid. War. In the winter and early spring of 1838, the American Peace Society held a course of lectures in Boston. This lecture was the 7th in the course. Mr. Alcott wrote in his diary at that time. I heard Emerson's lecture on peace, as the closing discourse of a series delivered at the Odeon before the American Peace Society. After the lecture I saw Mr. Garrison, who is at this time deeply interested in the question of peace, as are many of the meekest and noblest souls amongst us. He expressed his great pleasure in the stand taken by Mr. Emerson and his hopes in him as a man of the new age. This great topic has been brought before the general mind as a direct consequence of the agitation of the abolition of slavery. The lecture was printed in 1849 Aesthetic Papers, edited by Miss Elizabeth P. Peabody. Although the chronicles of the campaigns and acts of prowess of the masterly soldiers were always attractive reading to Mr. Emerson, much more acts of patriotic devotion in the field, and he was by no means committed as a non-resistant, he saw that war had been a part of evolution, and that its evils might pave the way for good. As flowers spring up next year on a field of carnage. He knew that evolution required an almost divine patience, yet his good hope was strengthened by the signs of the times, and he desired to hasten the great upward step in civilization. It is evident from his words and course of action during the outrages upon the peaceful settlers of Kansas, and when Sumter was fired upon and Washington threatened, that he recognized that the hour had not yet come. He subscribed lavishly from his limited means for the furnishing Sharp's rifles to the Free State men. In the early days of the War of the Rebellion he visited Charlestown Navy Yard to see the preparations, and said, "Ah! Sometimes gunpowder smells good." In the opening of his address at Tufts College, in July, 1861, he said, "The brute noise of cannon has a most poetic echo in these days, as instrument of the primal sentiments of humanity." Several speeches included in this volume show that at that crisis his feeling was, as he had said of the forefathers, deed of blood, at Concord Bridge. Even the serene reason says, "It was well done." But all this was only a postponement of hope. With regard to schooling a man's courage for whatever may befall, Mr. Emerson said, "Our culture therefore must not omit the arming of the man. Let him hear in season that he is born into the state of war, and that the Commonwealth and his own well-being require that he should not go dancing in the weeds of peace, but warned, self-collected and neither defying nor dreading the thunder. Let him take both reputation and life in his hand, and with perfect urbanity dare the gibbet and the mob by the absolute truth of his speech and the rectitude of his behavior." Heroism, Essays, First Series. A state of war or anarchy, in which law has little force, is so far valuable that it puts every man on trial. The Conservative, Nature, Addresses and Lectures. Mr. Emerson used to take pleasure in a story illustrating this common foible of mankind. A returned Arctic explorer, in a lecture, said, "In this wilderness among the ice floes, I had the fortune to see a terrible conflict between two polar bears, which beat," cried an excited voice from the audience. In his description of the Tower of London in the Journal of 1834, it appears that the suits of armor there set up affected Mr. Emerson unpleasantly, suggesting half-human destructive lobsters and crabs. It is, I believe, said that Benvenuto Cellini learned to make the cunning joints in armor for men from those of these marine warriors. In the opening paragraphs of the essay on inspiration Mr. Emerson congratulates himself that the doleful experiences of the aboriginal man were got through with long ago. They combed his mane, they pared his nails, cut off his tail, set him on end, sent him to school and made him pay taxes, before he could begin to write his sad story for the compassion or the repudiation of his descendants, who are all but unanimous to disown him. We must take him as we find him, etc. In English Traits, at the end of the chapter on Stonehenge, Mr. Emerson gave a humorous account of his setting forth the faith or hope of the non-resistants and idealists in New England, to the amazed and shocked ears of Carlyle and Arthur Helps. As the solidest rocks are made up of invisible gases, as the world is made of thickened light and arrested electricity, so men know that ideas are the parents of men and things, there was never anything that did not proceed from a thought. The Scholar, Lectures and Biographical Sketches. In The Problem, he says of the Parthenon and England's abbeys that, "Out of thought's interior sphere, these wonders rose to upper air." Mr. Emerson in his conversation frankly showed that he was not yet quite prepared to be a non-resistant. He would have surely followed his own counsel where he says, "Go face the burglar in your own house, and he seemed to feel instinctive sympathy with what Mr. Dexter, the counsel, said in the speech which he used to read me from the Selfridge trial. And may my arm drop powerless when it fails to defend my honor. He exactly stated his own position in a later passage, where he says that, in a given extreme event nature and God will instruct him in that hour. Thoreau lived frankly and fearlessly up to this standard. This same view is even more attractively set forth in Aristocracy, Lectures and Biographical Sketches, pages 36 to 40. Reverend Dr. Cyrus A. Bartle, in an interesting paper on Emerson's Religion, gives, among other reminiscences, the following: I asked him if he approved of war. Yes, he said, in one born to fight. The Fugitive Slave Law, Concord, 1851. The opening passages of this speech to his friends and neighbors show how deeply Mr. Emerson was moved. He could no longer be philosophical, as in the Ode inscribed to his friend William Channing, and in earlier addresses. The time had come when he might at any moment be summoned to help the Marshal's men seize and return to bondage the poor fugitive who had almost reached the safety of England's protection. Such men were frequently passing through Concord, concealed and helped by the good Bigelow, the blacksmith, and his wife, the Thoreaus, Mrs. Brooks, and even once at a critical moment by her husband, the law-abiding Squire himself. Mr. Emerson instantly took his stand, and did not hesitate to run a tilt against the dark giant, once so honored. The question of secession for conscience' sake had come up among the abolitionists. Mr. Emerson had stood for union, yet felt that there could be nothing but shame in union until the humiliating statute was repealed. Meanwhile he fell back on the reserve right of individual revolution as the duty of honest men. The Free Soilers soon after renominated Dr. John Gorham Palfrey for a seat in Congress, and in his campaign Mr. Emerson delivered this speech in several Middlesex towns. In Cambridge he was interrupted by young men from the college, Southerners, it was said, but it appears that the disturbance was quite as much due to Northern men who were eager to keep up a show of fidelity to the interest of the South. As a Southern student said in a dignified disclaimer. Mr. Cabot in his memoir gives an interesting account by Professor James B. Thayer of Mr. Emerson's calm ignoring of the rude and hostile demonstration. Writing to Carlyle, in the end of July, 1857, Mr. Emerson said, in the spring, the abomination of our fugitive slave bill drove me to some writing and speech-making, without hope of effect, but to clear my own skirts. This was the reaction which could not but be felt by him where he had been forced to descend into the dust and conflict of the arena from the serene heights. He wrote in his journal next year. Philip Randolph, a valued friend, was surprised to find me speaking to the politics of anti-slavery in Philadelphia. I suppose because he thought me a believer in general laws and that it was a kind of distrust of my own general teachings to appear in active sympathy with these temporary heats. He is right so far as it is becoming in the scholar to insist on central soundness rather than on superficial applications. I am to give a wise and just ballot, though no man else in the Republic doth. I am to demand the absolute right, affirm that, and do that, but not push Boston into a showy and theatrical attitude, endeavoring to persuade her she is more virtuous than she is. Thereby I am robbing myself more than I am enriching the public. After 20, 50, 100 years, it will be quite easy to discriminate who stood for the right, and who for the expedient. Yet however hard the duty of the hour might be, Mr. Emerson never failed in his duty as a good citizen to come to the front in dark days. In spite of all his gracefulness and reserve and love of the unbroken tranquility of serene thought, he was by the right of heredity a belligerent in the cause of freedom. Shadrach was hurried to Concord after his rescue, and by curious coincidence Edwin Bigelow, the good village blacksmith who there harbored him and drove him to the New Hampshire line, was one of the jurors in the trial of another rescue case. Mr. Emerson wrote in his journal, after Mr. Hoare's return. The position of Massachusetts seems to me to be better for Mr. Hoare's visit to South Carolina in this point, that one illusion is dispelled. Massachusetts was dishonored before, but she was credulous in the protection of the Constitution, and either did not believe, or affected not to believe in that she was dishonored. Now all doubt on that subject is removed, and every Carolina boy will not fail to tell every Massachusetts boy whenever they meet how the fact stands. The Boston merchants would willingly salve the matter over, but they cannot hereafter receive Southern gentlemen at their tables without a consciousness of shame. Apparently from Vattel, Book I, Chi, page 79. But there was chaff within the flour. And one was false in 10. And reckless clerks in lust of power forgot the rights of men. Cruel and blind did file their mind, and sell the blood of humankind. Your town is full of gentle names. By patriots once were watchwords made. Those war-cry names are muffled shames, on recreant sons mislaid. What slave shall dare a name to wear? Once freedom's passport everywhere. See note to poem, Boston. Mr. Charles Francis Adams's Life of Richard H. Dana gives light on the phrase used in the first of these verses. The following passage is from Mr. Dana's journal during the trial of Anthony Burns, the fugitive. Choate, I had an amusing interview with. I asked him to make one effort in favor of freedom, and told him that the 1850 delusion was dispelled and all men were coming round, the Board of Brokers and Board of Aldermen were talking treason, and that he must come and act. He said he should be glad to make an effort on our side, but that he had given written opinions against us in the Sims case on every point, and that he could not go against them. You corrupted your mind in 1850. Yes. Filed my mind. I wish you would file it in court for our benefit. Shakespeare said. For Banquo's issue have I filed my mind. Mr. F. B. Sanborn, in his Life of Thoreau, says that Webster gave, as a reason for not visiting Concord in his later years, that many of those whom I so highly esteemed in your beautiful and quiet village have become a good deal estranged, to my great grief. By abolitionism, free soilism, transcendentalism and other notions which I cannot but regard as so many vagaries of the imagination. Or who, with accent bolder, dare praise the freedom-loving mountaineer? I found by thee, O rushing Kentuckuk, and in thy valleys, Agiochuk, the jackals of the Negro holder. Virtue palters, right is hence. Freedom praised, but hid. Funeral eloquence rattles the coffin lid. Poems, Ode, inscribed to W. H. Channing. See also what is said of the treachery of scholars, in the last pages of The Man of Letters, Lectures and Biographical Sketches. This appeal for a general movement in the free states to free the slaves and to recompense the planters, unhappily brought up to the institution, for their loss, was so much better in an anti-slavery address in New York, in 1855. Than in the Concord speech 4 years earlier, that I have substituted the later version here. In Mr. Cabot's memoir, pages 558 to 593, a portion of the New York speech, including this paragraph, is given. The Fugitive Slave Law, New York, 1854. Writing to his friend Carlyle on March 11, 1854, Mr. Emerson said, "One good word closed your letter in September, namely, that you might come westward when Frederick was disposed of. Speed Frederick, then, for all reasons and for this. America is growing furiously, town and state. New Kansas, New Nebraska looming up in these days, vicious politicians seething a wretched destiny for them already at Washington. The politicians shall be sodden, the states escape, please God. The fight of slave and freeman drawing nearer, the question is sharply, whether slavery or whether freedom shall be abolished. Come and see." For days before thus writing, he had given this address, to a fairly large audience, in the Tabernacle, in New York City, for, however dark the horizon looked, the very success of the slave power was working its ruin. Encouraged by the submission of the North to the passage of the evil law to pacify them, they had resolved to repeal the Missouri Compromise, which confined slavery to a certain latitude. It was repealed within a few days of the time Mr. Emerson made this address. During the debate, Charles Sumner said to Douglas, "Sir, the bill you are about to pass is at once the worst and the best on which Congress has ever acted. It is the worst bill because it is a present victory for slavery. Sir, it is the best bill on which Congress has ever acted, for it annuls all past compromises with slavery and makes any future compromises impossible. Thus it puts freedom and slavery face to face and bids them grapple. Who can doubt the result?" The rendition to slavery of Anthony Burns from Boston in May wrought a great change in public feeling there. Even the commercial element in the North felt the shame. Though not a worker in the anti-slavery organization, Mr. Emerson had always been the outspoken friend of freedom for the Negroes. Witness his tribute in 1837 to Elijah Lovejoy, the martyr in their cause, see Heroism, Essays, First Series, page 262, and note. But the narrow and uncharitable speech and demeanor of many philanthropists led him to such reproofs as the one quoted by Dr. Bartle, "Let them first be anthropic," or that in Self-Reliance, to the angry bigot, "Go love thy infant. Love thy wood-chopper, be good-natured and modest, have that grace, and never varnish your hard, uncharitable ambition with this incredible tenderness for black folk 1,000 miles off." But now the foe was at the very gate. The duty to resist was instant and commanding. Mr. Emerson wrote in his journal, soon after. "Why do we not say, we are abolitionists of the most absolute abolition, as every man that is a man must be? We do not try to alter your laws in Alabama, nor yours in Japan, or in the Fiji Islands, but we do not admit them or permit a trace of them here. Nor shall we suffer you to carry your Thuggism, north, south, east or west into a single rod of territory which we control. We intend to set and keep a cordon sanitaire all around the infected district, and by no means suffer the pestilence to spread. It is impossible to be a gentleman, and not be an abolitionist, for a gentleman is one who is fulfilled with all nobleness, and imparts it, is the natural defender and raiser of the weak and oppressed." With Mr. Emerson's indignation at Webster's fall was mingled great sorrow. From his youth he had admired and revered him. The verses about him printed in the appendix to the poems show the change of feeling. He used to quote Browning's Lost Leader as applying to him, and admired Whittier's fine poem Ichabod, "The glory is departed," I, Samuel, for 21:22, on his apostasy. Mr. Emerson's faithfulness to his sense of duty, leading him, against his native instincts, into the turmoil of politics, striving to undo the mischief that a leader once revered had wrought in the minds of Americans, is shown in the extract from his journal with regard to this lecture. "At New York Tabernacle, on the March 7th, I saw the great audience with dismay, and told the bragging secretary that I was most thankful to those that stayed at home. Every auditor was a new affliction, and if all had stayed away, by rain or preoccupation, I had been best pleased. In lectures and biographical sketches, in the essay on aristocracy, and also in that on the man of letters, the duty of loyalty to his thought and his order is urged as a trait of the gentleman and the scholar, and in the latter essay, the scholar's duty to stand for what is generous and free. Mr. Emerson in his early youth did come near slavery for a short time. His diary at St. Augustine, quoted by Mr. Cabot in his memoir, mentions that, while he was attending a meeting of the Bible Society, a slave auction was going on outside, but it does not appear that he actually saw it. Carlyle described Webster as a magnificent specimen. As a logic fencer, advocate, or parliamentary Hercules, one would incline to back him at first sight against all the extant world. The tanned complexion, that amorphous, crag-like face, the dull black eyes under their precipice of brows, like dull anthracite furnaces needing only to be blown, the mastiff mouth, accurately closed, I have not traced as much of silent berserker rage, that I remember of, in any other man. Mr. James S. Gibbons, of the New York Tribune, in a letter written to his son 2 days after this speech was delivered, says, referring evidently to this passage, "Emerson gave us a fine lecture on Webster. He made him stand before us in the proportions of a giant, and then with one word crushed him to powder. Professor John H. Wright of Harvard University has kindly furnished me with the passage from Dio Cassius, 47:49, where it is said of Brutus. Kappa alpha nu alpha beta omicron sigma alpha tau omicron delta rho kappa lambda epsilon iota omicron nu. Tau lambda mu omicron nu rho epsilon tau, lambda gamma omicron rho, sigma theta, gamma delta sigma epsilon. Rho gamma omicron nu sigma kappa omicron upsilon nu, sigma delta, rho, delta omicron lambda epsilon tau chi. Pi alpha rho alpha kappa lambda epsilon sigma tau iota nu alpha tau nu sigma upsilon nu tau omega nu alpha tau nu pi omicron kappa tau epsilon nu. Which he renders. He cried out this sentiment of Heracles, O wretched virtue, after all, thou art a name, but I cherished thee as a fact. Fortune's slave wast thou, and called upon one of those with him to slay him. Professor Wright adds that Theodorus Prodromus, a Byzantine poet of the 12th century, said, what Brutus says, O virtue, etc. I pronounce to be ignoble and unworthy of Brutus's soul. It seems very doubtful whence the Greek verses came. Just 10 years earlier, Hon. Samuel Hoar, the Commissioner of Massachusetts, sent to Charleston, South Carolina, in the interests of our colored citizens there constantly imprisoned and ill-used, had been expelled from that state with a show of force. See Lectures and Biographical Sketches. The sending back of one Zymus by Paul was a precedent precious in the eyes of pro-slavery preachers, North and South, in those days, ignoring, however, Paul's message, not now as a servant, but above a servant, a brother beloved, specially to me. But how much more unto thee, both in the flesh and in the Lord. If thou count me therefore a partner, receive him as myself. The hydrostatic paradox has been before alluded to as one of Mr. Emerson's favorite symbols, the balancing of the ocean by a few drops of water. In many places he dwells on the power of minorities, a minority of one. In Character, Lectures and Biographical Sketches, he says, there was a time when Christianity existed in one child. For the value and duty of minorities, see Conduct of Life, pages 249 ff, Letters and Social Aims, pages 219, 220. This was a saying of Muhammad. What follows, with regard to the divine sentiments always soliciting us, is thus rendered in My Garden. Ever the words of the gods resound. But the porches of man's ear, seldom in this low life's round, are unsealed, that he may hear. This is the important key to the essay on self-reliance. In the Sovereignty of Ethics, Mr. Emerson quotes an Oriental poet describing the Golden Age as saying that God had made justice so dear to the heart of nature that, if any injustice lurked anywhere under the sky, the blue vault would shrivel to a snake skin and cast it out by spasms. There seems to be some break in the construction here, probably due to the imperfect adjustment of lecture sheets. It would seem that the passage should read, Liberty is never cheap. It is made difficult because freedom is the accomplishment and perfectness of man, the finished man, earning and bestowing good, etc. See Lectures and Biographical Sketches, pages 246 and 251. The occasion alluded to was Honorable Robert C. Winthrop's speech to the alumni of Harvard College on Commencement Day in 1852. What follows is not an abstract, but Mr. Emerson's rendering of the spirit of his address. The assault upon Mr. Sumner. One evening in May, Judge Hort came to Mr. Emerson's house, evidently deeply stirred, and told in a few words the startling news that the great senator from Massachusetts had been struck down at his desk by a representative from South Carolina, and was dangerously hurt. The news was heard with indignant grief in Concord, and a public meeting was held 4 days later in which Mr. Emerson and others gave vent to this feeling. Among Mr. Emerson's papers are the fragmentary notes on Sumner, given below, without indication as to when they were used. Charles Sumner. Clean, self-poised, great-hearted man, noble in person, incorruptible in life, the friend of the poor, the champion of the oppressed. Of course Congress must draw from every part of the country swarms of individuals eager only for private interests, who could not love his stern justice. But if they gave him no high employment, he made low work high by the dignity of honesty and truth. But men cannot long do without faculty and perseverance, and he rose, step by step, to the mastery of all affairs entrusted to him, and by those lights and upliftings with which the spirit that makes the universe rewards labor and brave truth. He became learned, and adequate to the highest questions, and the counselor of every correction of old errors, and of every noble reform. How nobly he bore himself in disastrous times! Every reform he led or assisted. In the shock of the war his patriotism never failed. A man of varied learning and accomplishments. He held that every man is to be judged by the horizon of his mind, and fame he defined as the shadow of excellence, but that which follows him, not which he follows after. Tragic character, like Algernon Sidney, man of conscience and courage, but without humor. Fear did not exist for him. In his mind the American idea is no crab, but a man incessantly advancing, as the shadow of the dial or the heavenly body that casts it. The American idea is emancipation, to abolish kingcraft, feudalism, black-letter monopoly. It pulls down the gallows, explodes priestcraft, opens the doors of the sea to all emigrants, extemporizes government in new country. Sumner has been collecting his works. They will be the history of the Republic for the last 25 years, as told by a brave, perfectly honest and well-instructed man, with social culture and relation to all eminent persons. Diligent and able workman, with rare ability, without genius, without humor, but with persevering study, wide reading, excellent memory, high stand of honor, and pure devotion to his country, disdaining any bribe, any compliances. And incapable of falsehood. His singular advantages of person, of manners, and a statesman's conversation impress every one favorably. He has the foible of most public men, the egotism which seems almost unavoidable at Washington. I sat in his room once at Washington whilst he wrote a weary procession of letters, he writing without pause as fast as if he were copying. He outshines all his mates in historical conversation, and is so public in his regards that he cannot be relied on to push an office-seeker, so that he is no favorite with politicians. But wherever I have met with a dear lover of the country and its moral interests, he is sure to be a supporter of Sumner. It characterizes a man for me that he hates Charles Sumner, for it shows that he cannot discriminate between a foible and a vice. Sumner's moral instinct and character are so exceptionally pure that he must have perpetual magnetism for honest men. His ability and working energy such, that every good friend of the Republic must stand by him. Those who come near him and are offended by his egotism, or his foible, if you please, of using classic quotations, or other bad tastes, easily forgive these whims, if themselves are good, or magnify them into disgust. If they themselves are incapable of his virtue. And when he read one night in Concord a lecture on Lafayette, we felt that of all Americans he was best entitled by his own character and fortunes to read that eulogy. Every Pericles must have his Cleon. Sumner had his adversaries, his wasps and backbiters. We almost wished that he had not stooped to answer them. But he condescended to give them truth and patriotism, without asking whether they could appreciate the instruction or not. A man of such truth that he can be truly described, he needs no exaggerated praise. Not a man of extraordinary genius, but a man of great heart, of a perpetual youth, with the highest sense of honor, incapable of any fraud, little or large. Loving his friend and loving his country, with perfect steadiness to his purpose, shunning no labor that his aim required, and his works justified him by their scope and thoroughness. He had good masters, who quickly found that they had a good scholar. He read law with Judge Story, who was at the head of the law school at Harvard University, and who speedily discovered the value of his pupil, and called him to his assistance in the law school. He had a great talent for labor, and spared no time and no research to make himself master of his subject. His treatment of every question was faithful and exhaustive, and marked always by the noble sentiment. With this message of comfort to Sumner, struck down for his defense of liberty, may be contrasted what is said of Webster when he abandoned her cause. Those to whom his name was once dear and honored, as the manly statesman to whom the choicest gifts of nature had been accorded, disown him. He who was their pride in the woods and mountains of New England is now their mortification. They have torn his picture from the wall, they have thrust his speeches into the chimney, etc. Address on the Fugitive Slave Law, at Concord, 1851. Speech on Affairs in Kansas. By an act of Congress, passed in May, 1854, the territories of Kansas and Nebraska were organized. And in a section of that act it was declared that the Constitution and all the laws of the United States should be in force in these territories, except the Missouri Compromise Act of 1820, which was declared inoperative and void. The act thereby repealed had confined slavery to the region of the Louisiana Purchase south of latitude 36 degrees, 30 north. Foreseeing the probable success of this measure to increase the area of slavery, emigrant aid societies had been formed in Massachusetts first, and later, in Connecticut, which assisted northern emigrants to the settlement of this fertile region. Settlers from the northwestern states also poured in, and also from Missouri, the latter bringing slaves with them. A fierce struggle, lasting for some years and attended with bloodshed and barbarities, began at once, hordes of armed men from the border state of Missouri constantly voting at Kansas elections and intimidating the free state settlers. And even driving parties of immigrants out of the state. Franklin Pierce was then president, and through the influence and power of the administration on the side of the pro-slavery party in Kansas. Despairing of redress from Washington, the settlers from the free states appealed in their distress to their friends at home, and sent Mr. Whitman, Reverend Mr. Newt, and later, John Brown, to make known to them their wrongs, and ask moral and material aid, especially arms to defend their rights, and reinforcements of brave settlers. Meetings were held, not only in the cities, but in the country towns, and, certainly in the latter, were well attended by earnest people who gave, a few from their wealth, but many from their poverty, large sums to help bleeding Kansas. In response to the petitions of the Friends of Freedom, who urged the legislature of Massachusetts to come to the rescue. A joint committee was appointed by the General Court to consider the petitions for a state appropriation of $10,000 to protect the interests of the North and the rights of her citizens in Kansas, should they be again invaded by Southern marauders. John Brown addressed this committee in February, 1856. He made a clear and startling statement of the outrages he had witnessed and the brave struggles of the settlers, and told of the murder and imprisonment and maltreatment of his sons, 7 of whom were in Kansas with him during the struggle. Mr. Emerson always attended the meetings in aid of Kansas in Concord, gave liberally to the cause, and spoke there and elsewhere when called upon. George Bancroft, the historian, said of the conclusion of this speech, Emerson as clearly as any one, perhaps more clearly than anyone at the time, saw the enormous dangers that were gathering over the Constitution. It would certainly be difficult, perhaps impossible, to find any speech made in the same year that is marked with so much courage and foresight as this of Emerson. Even after the inauguration of Lincoln several months passed away before his Secretary of State or he himself saw the future so clearly as Emerson had foreshadowed it in 1856. John Brown, Speech at Boston. Mr. F. B. Sanborn, in his Familiar Letters of Thoreau, says that he introduced John Brown to Thoreau in March, 1857, and Thoreau introduced him to Emerson. This was at the time when Brown came on to awaken the people of Massachusetts to the outrages which the settlers and their families were suffering, and procure aid for them. His clear-cut face, smooth-shaven and bronzed, his firmly shut mouth and mild but steady blue eyes, gave him the appearance of the best type of old New England farmers. Indeed he might well have passed for a rustic brother of Squire Hoare. Mr. Emerson was at once interested in him and the story of the gallant fight that the Free State men in Kansas were making, though Brown was very modest about his own part and leadership. Indeed he claimed only to be a fellow worker and adviser. I think that soon after this time, on one of his visits to Concord, he stayed at Mr. Emerson's house. Certainly he spent the evening there. The last time he came to Concord he was a changed man, all the pleasant look was gone. His gray hair, longer and brushed upright, his great gray beard and the sharpening of his features by exposure and rude experiences gave him a wild, fierce expression. His speech in the town hall was excited, and when he drew a huge sheath knife from under his coat and showed it as a symbol of Missouri civilization, and last drew from his bosom a horse chain and clanked it in air, telling that his son had been bound with this and led bareheaded under a burning sun beside their horses, by United States dragoons, and in the mania brought on by this inhuman treatment had worn the rusty chain bright. The old man recalled the fierce Balfour of Burleigh in Scott's Old Mortality. It was a startling sight and sent a thrill through his hearers. Yet on earlier occasions his speech had been really more effective, when a quiet farmer of mature years, evidently self-contained, intelligent, truthful and humane, simply told in New England towns what was going on in Kansas. The outrages committed upon the settlers, the violation of their elementary rights under the Constitution, and all this connived at by the general government. He opened the eyes of his hearers, even against their wills, to the alarming pass into which the slave power had brought the affairs of the country. But now wrong and outrage, not only on others but terribly suffered in his own family, had made Brown feel that not he but slavery was an outlaw, against which he held a commission direct from God Almighty to act. A friend quoted him as having said, "The loss of my family and the troubles in Kansas have shattered my constitution, and I am nothing to the world but to defend the right, and that, by God's help, I have done and will do." The people were not ready to follow him in revolutionary measures, but when on his own responsibility he had precipitated the inevitable conflict by breaking with a government, then so unrighteous, and offered his life as a sacrifice for humanity, they could not but do homage to him as a hero, who was technically a traitor. He had cut the Gordian knot which they had suffered to be tied tighter. Of course Mr. Emerson had known nothing of John Brown's plan for a raid into the slave states. It was the motive and courage he honored, not the means. He wrote, "I wish we should have health enough to know virtue when we see it, and not cry with the fools and the newspapers, 'Madman,' when a hero passes." On the 1st day of November, John Brown had been sentenced to death. This meeting in Boston, to give aid to his family, was held on the 18th, just 2 weeks before his execution. The verses which serve as motto are from Mr. Edmund Clarence Stedman's poem written at the time, which Mr. Emerson used to read aloud to his family and friends with much pleasure. This court acknowledges, I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here which I suppose to be the Bible, or, at least, the New Testament. That teaches me that all things, whatsoever I would that men should do unto me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them which are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavored to act up to that instruction. I say I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted that I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. From the speech of John Brown to the court. Among the sheets of the lecture, Courage, is one which seems to have been used at that time. Governor Wise and Mr. Mason no doubt have some right to their places. It is some superiority of working brain that put them there, and the aristocrats in every society. But when they come to deal with Brown, they find that he speaks their own speech, has whatever courage and directness they have, and a great deal more of the same, so that they feel themselves timorous little fellows in his hand. He outsees, outthinks, outacts them, and they are forced to shuffle and stammer in their turn. They painfully feel this, that he is their governor and superior, and the only alternative is to kneel to him if they are truly noble, or else, if they wish to keep their places, to put this fact which they know, out of sight of other people, as fast as they can. Quick, drums and trumpets strike up. Quick, judges and juries, silence him, by sentence and execution of sentence, and hide in the ground this alarming fact. For, if everything comes to its right place, he goes up, and we down. Commodore Hiram Paulding, in 1857, had broken up Walker's filibustering expedition at Nicaragua. The arrest of Walker on foreign soil the government did not think it wise wholly to approve. The allusion is to the trials of the fugitives Shadrach, Sims and Burns in Boston. The story of these humiliations is told in full and in a most interesting manner in the diary of Richard H. Dana, whose zeal in the cause of these poor men did him great honor. During the trial of Sims, a chain was put up, as a barrier against the crowd, around the United States courthouse. And the stooping of the judges to creep under this chain in order to enter the courthouse was considered symbolic of their abject attitude towards the aggressive slave power. John Brown, Speech at Salem. The 2nd of December, on which day John Brown was executed at Charlestown, Virginia, was bright in that state, but in New England was of a strange sultriness with a wind from the south and a lowering sky. At noon, the hour appointed for his death, in Concord, as in many New England towns, the men and women who honored his character and motives gathered and made solemn observance of a day and event which seemed laden with omens. There was a prayer, I think offered by the Reverend Edmund Sears of Wayland, Mr. Emerson read William Allingham's beautiful poem, The Touchstone, which is used as the motto to this speech. Thoreau read with sad bitterness Sir Walter Raleigh's, The Soul's Errand. Honorable John S. Keyes read some appropriate verses from A Town's Execution of Montrose, and Mr. Sanborn a poem which he had written for the occasion. Here, as often in Mr. Emerson's speech and writing, is shown his respect for the old religion of New England and its effect on the thought and character of her people. As Lowell said of them in his Concord Ode in 1875. And yet the enduring half they chose. Whose choice decides a man life's slave or king. The invisible things of God before the seen and known. I well remember the evening, in my schoolboy days, when John Brown, in my father's house, told of his experiences as a sheep farmer, and his eye for animals and power over them. He said he knew at once a strange sheep in his flock of many hundred, and that he could always make a dog or cat so uncomfortable as to wish to leave the room, simply by fixing his eyes on it. Heroism feels and never reasons, and therefore is always right. And although a different breeding, different religion and greater intellectual activity would have modified or even reversed the particular action, yet, for the hero, that thing he does is the highest deed. And is not open to the censure of philosophers and divines. Heroism, Essays, First Series. I can leave to God the time and means of my death. For I believe now that the sealing of my testimony before God and man with my blood will do far more to further the cause to which I have earnestly devoted myself than anything else I have done in my life. Letter of John Brown to a friend. Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker, worn by his great work in defense of liberal religion and in every cause of suffering humanity, had succumbed to disease and died in Florence in May, 1860, not quite 50 years of age. Born in the neighbor town of Lexington when Emerson was 7 years old, they had been friends probably from the time when the latter, soon after settling in Concord, preached for the Society at East Lexington, from 1836 for 2 years. Parker was, during this period, studying divinity, and was settled as pastor of the West Roxbury Church in 1837. In that year he is mentioned by Mr. Alcott as a member of the Transcendental Club and attending its meetings in Boston. When, in June, 1838, Mr. Emerson fluttered the conservative and the timid by his divinity school address, the young Parker went home and wrote, "It was the most inspiring strain I ever listened to. My soul is roused, and this week I shall write the long-meditated sermons on the state of the Church and the duties of these times." Mr. Parker was one of those who attended the gathering in Boston which gave birth to the Dial, to which he was a strong contributor. 3 years after its death, he, with the help of Mr. James Eliot Cabot and Mr. Emerson, founded the Massachusetts Quarterly Review, vigorous though short-lived, of which he was the editor. Parker frequently visited Emerson, and the two, unlike in their method, worked best apart in the same great causes. Rev. William Gannett says, "What Emerson uttered without plot or plan, Theodore Parker elaborated to a system." Parker was the Paul of Transcendentalism. Mr. Edwin D. Mead, in his chapter on Emerson and Theodore Parker, gives the following pleasant anecdote. At one of Emerson's lectures in Boston, when the storm against Parker was fiercest, a lecture at which a score of the religious and literary leaders of the city were present, Emerson, as he laid his manuscript upon the desk and looked over the audience, after his wont, observed Parker. And immediately he stepped from the platform to the seat near the front where Parker sat, grasping his hand and standing for a moment's conversation with him. It was not ostentation, and it was not patronage, it was admiring friendship, and that fortification and stimulus Parker in those times never failed to feel. It was Emerson who fed his lamp, he said. And Emerson said that, be the lamp fed as it might, it was Parker whom the time to come would have to thank for finding the light burning. Parker dedicated to Emerson his 10 sermons on religion. In acknowledging this tribute, Mr. Emerson thus paid tribute to Parker's brave service. We shall all thank the right soldier whom God gave strength to fight for him the battle of the day. When Mr. Parker's failing forces made it necessary for him to drop his arduous work and go abroad for rest, Mr. Emerson was frequently called to take his place in the music hall on Sundays. I think that this was the only pulpit he went into to conduct Sunday services after 1838. It is told that Parker, sitting, on Sunday morning, on the deck of the vessel that was bearing him away, never to return, smiled and said, Emerson is preaching at music hall today. Mr. Emerson wrote in his journal. The Duc de Brancas said, why need I read the encyclopedia? Rivarol visits me. I may well say it of Theodore Parker. Richard H. Dana wrote in his diary, November 3, 1853. It is now 10 days since Webster's death. Strange that the best commendation that has appeared yet, the most touching, elevated, meaning eulogy, with all its censure, should have come from Theodore Parker. Were I Daniel Webster, I would not have that sermon destroyed for all that had been said in my favor as yet. I copy from Mr. Emerson's journal at the time of Mr. Parker's death these sentences which precede some of those included in this address. Theodore Parker has filled up all his years and days and hours. A son of the energy of New England. Restless, eager, manly, brave, early old, contumacious, clever. I can well praise him at a spectator's distance, for our minds and methods were unlike, few people more unlike. All the virtues are solitaires. Each man is related to persons who are not related to each other, and I saw with pleasure that men whom I could not approach, were drawn through him to the admiration of that which I admire. American Civilization. On January 31, 1862, Mr. Emerson lectured at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington on American civilization. Just after the outbreak of war in the April preceding, he had given a lecture, in a course in Boston on life and literature, which he called Civilization at a Pinch. The title suggesting how it had been modified by the crisis which had suddenly come to pass. In the course of the year the flocking of slaves to the Union camps, and the opening vista of a long and bitter struggle, with slavery now acknowledged as its root, had brought the question of emancipation as a war measure to the front. Of course Mr. Emerson saw hope in this situation of affairs, and when he went to Washington with the chance of being heard by men in power there, he prepared himself to urge the measure, as well on grounds of policy as of right. So the Boston lecture was much expanded to deal with the need of the hour. There is no evidence that President Lincoln heard it, it is probable that he did not, nor is it true that Mr. Emerson had a long and earnest conversation with him on the subject next day, both of which assertions have been made in print. Mr. Emerson made an unusual record in his journal of the incidents of his stay in Washington, and though he tells of his introduction to Mr. Lincoln and a short chat with him, evidently there was little opportunity for serious conversation. The President's secretaries had, in 1886, no memory of his having attended the lecture, and the Washington papers do not mention his presence there. The following notice of the lecture, however, appeared in one of the local papers. The audience received it, as they have the other anti-slavery lectures of the course, with unbounded enthusiasm. It was in many respects a wonderful lecture, and those who have often heard Mr. Emerson said that he seemed inspired through nearly the whole of it, especially the part referring to slavery and the war. A gentleman in Washington, who took the trouble to look up the question as to whether Mr. Lincoln and other high officials heard it, says that Mr. Lincoln could hardly have attended lectures then. He was very busy at the time, Stanton the new War Secretary having just come in, and storming like a fury at the business of his department. The great operations of the war for the time overshadowed all the other events. It is worth remarking that Mr. Emerson in this lecture clearly foreshadowed the policy of emancipation some 6 or 8 months in advance of Mr. Lincoln. He saw the logic of events leading up to a crisis in our affairs, to emancipation as a platform with compensation to the loyal owners, his words as reported in the Star. The notice states that the lecture was very fully attended. Very possibly it may be with regard to this address that we have the interesting account given of the effect of Mr. Emerson's speaking on a well-known English author. D.R. Garnett, in his Life of Emerson, says, "A shrewd judge, Anthony Trollope, was particularly struck with the note of sincerity in Emerson when he heard him address a large meeting during the Civil War. Not only was the speaker terse, perspicuous, and practical to a degree amazing to Mr. Trollope's preconceived notions, but he commanded his hearers' respect by the frankness of his dealing with them. You make much of the American eagle, he said, you do well. But beware of the American peacock." When shortly afterwards Mr. Trollope heard the consummate rhetorician, he discerned at once that oratory was an end with him, instead of, as with Emerson, a means. He was neither bold nor honest, as Emerson had been, and the people knew that while pretending to lead them he was led by them. Mr. Emerson revised the lecture and printed it in the Atlantic Monthly for April, 1862. It was afterwards separated into the essay, Civilization, treating of the general and permanent aspects of the subject, printed in Society in Solitude, and this urgent appeal for the instant need. The few lines inspired by the flag are from one of the verse books. Mr. Emerson himself was by no means free from pecuniary anxieties and cares in those days. Journal, 1862. Poverty, sickness, a lawsuit, even bad, dark weather, spoil a great many days of the scholar's year, hinder him of the frolic freedom necessary to spontaneous flow of thought. This was during the days of apparent inaction when, after the first reverses or minor successes of the raw northern armies, the magnitude of the task before them and the energy of their opponents was realized, and recruiting, fortification, organization was going on in earnest in preparation for the spring campaign. General Scott had resigned, General McClellan was doing his admirable work of creating a fit army, and Secretary Cameron had been succeeded by the energetic and impatient Stanton. But the government was still very shy of meddling with slavery for fear of disaffecting the war Democrats and especially the border states. A short time before this address was delivered Mr. Montgomery D. Conway, a young Virginian, who, for conscience' sake, had left his charge as a Methodist preacher and had abandoned his inheritance in slaves, losing in so doing the goodwill of his parents, and become a Unitarian minister and an abolitionist, had read in Concord an admirable and eloquent lecture called The Rejected Stone. This stone, slighted by the founders, although they knew it to be a source of danger, had now become the head of the corner, and its continuance in the national structure threatened its stability. Mr. Emerson had been much struck with the excellence and cogency of Mr. Conway's arguments, based on his knowledge of Southern economics and character, and in this lecture made free use of them. Mason and Slidell, the emissaries sent by the Confederacy to excite sympathy in its cause in Europe, had been taken off an English vessel at the Bermudas by Commodore Wilkes, and were confined in Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. President Lincoln's action in surrendering them at England's demand had been a surprise to the country, but was well received. From the Vishnu Sarma. See in the address on Theodore Parker the passage commending him for insisting that the essence of Christianity is its practical morals, it is there for use or nothing, etc. In the agitation concerning the abolition of slavery in the British colonies, gradual emancipation was at first planned, as more reasonable and politic, but, in the end, Not only the reformers but the planters came in most cases to see that immediate emancipation was wiser. The Emancipation Proclamation. On the 22d of September, President Lincoln at last spoke the words so long earnestly desired by the friends of freedom and the victims of slavery. Abolishing slavery on the first day of the coming year in those states which should then be in rebellion against the United States. At a meeting held in Boston in honor of this auspicious utterance, Mr. Emerson spoke, with others. The address was printed in its present form in the Atlantic Monthly for November, 1862. It may be interesting in this connection to recall the quiet joy with which Mr. Emerson in his poem, The Adirondacks, celebrates man's victory over matter, and its promise to human brotherhood, when the Atlantic cable was supposed to be a success in 1858. Milton, Comus. It is pleasant to contrast this passage with the tone of sad humiliation which prevails in the address on the fugitive slave law given in Concord in 1851. See the insulting recognition of this disgraceful attitude of the North by John Randolph, quoted by Mr. Emerson in his speech on the fugitive slave law in Concord in 1851. Shakespeare, Sonnet Quae. The tragedy of the Negro is tenderly told in the poem Voluntaries, which was written just after they had gallantly stood the test of battle in the desperate attack on Fort Wagner. On the first day of the year 1863, when emancipation became a fact throughout the United States, a joyful meeting was held in Boston, and there Mr. Emerson read his Boston hymn. Abraham Lincoln. In the year 1865, the people of Concord gathered on the 19th of April, as had been their wont for 90 years, but this time not to celebrate the grasping by the town of its great opportunity for freedom and fame. The people came together in the old meeting house to mourn for their wise and good chief magistrate, murdered when he had triumphantly finished the great work which fell to his lot. Mr. Emerson, with others of his townsmen, spoke. On the occasion of his visit to Washington in January, 1862, Mr. Emerson had been taken to the White House by Mr. Sumner and introduced to the President. Mr. Lincoln's first remark was, "Mr. Emerson, I once heard you say in a lecture that a Kentuckian seems to say by his air and manners, 'Here am I, if you don't like me, the worse for you.'" The interview with Mr. Lincoln was necessarily short, but he left an agreeable impression on Mr. Emerson's mind. The full account of this visit is printed in the Atlantic Monthly for July, 1904, and will be included among the selections from the journals which will be later published. Mr. Emerson's poem, The Visit, shows how terrible the devastation of the day of a public man would have seemed to him. The brave retraction by Thomas Taylor of the hostile ridicule which Punch had poured on Lincoln in earlier days contained these verses. Beside this corpse, that bears for winding sheet the stars and stripes he lived to rear anew. Between the mourners at his head and feet. Say, scurrile jester, is there room for you? Yes, he had lived to shame me from my sneer. To lay my pencil, and confute my pen. To make me own this kind of prince's peer. This rail-splitter a true-born king of men. The whole poem is included in Mr. Emerson's collection Parnassus. This thought is rendered more fully in the poem, Spiritual Laws, and in the lines in Worship. This is he men miscall fate. Fretting dark ways, arriving late. But ever coming in time to crown the truth, and hurl wrongdoers down. The following letter was written by Mr. Emerson in November, 1863, to his friend, Mr. George P. Bradford, who, as Mr. Cabot says, came nearer to being a crony than any of the others. Concord. Dear George, I hope you do not need to be reminded that we rely on you at 2 o'clock on Thanksgiving Day. Bring all the climate and all the memories of Newport with you. Mr. Lincoln in fixing this day has in some sort bound himself to furnish good news and victories for it. If not, we must comfort each other with the good which already is, and with that which must be. Yours affectionately, R. W. Emerson. A year later, he wrote to the same friend. I give you joy of the election. Seldom in history was so much staked on a popular vote, I suppose never in history. One hears everywhere anecdotes of late, very late, remorse overtaking the hardened sinners and just saving them from final reprobation. Journal, 1864-65. Why talk of President Lincoln's equality of manners to the elegant or titled men with whom Everett or others saw him? A sincerely upright and intelligent man as he was, placed in the chair, has no need to think of his manners or appearance. His work day by day educates him rapidly and to the best. He exerts the enormous power of this continent in every hour, in every conversation, in every act. Thinks and decides under this pressure, forced to see the vast and various bearings of the measures he adopts. He cannot palter, he cannot but carry a grace beyond his own, a dignity, by means of what he drops, e.g. all pretension and trick, and arrives, of course, at a simplicity, which is the perfection of manners. Harvard Commemoration Speech. It was a proud and sad, and yet a joyful day, when Harvard welcomed back those of her sons who had survived the war. All who could come were there, from boys to middle-aged men, from private soldier to general, some strong and brown, and others worn and sick and maimed, but all on that day proud and happy. The names of the 93 of Harvard's sons who had fallen in the war were inscribed on 6 tablets and placed where all could see. In the church, where then the college exercises were held, the venerable ex-president, Dr. Walker, read the scriptures, Reverend Phillips Brooks offered prayer, a hymn by Robert Lowell was sung, and the address was made by the Reverend George Putnam. In the afternoon the alumni, civic and military, with their guests, were marshaled by Colonel Henry Lee into a great pavilion behind Harvard Hall, where they dined. Honorable Charles G. Loring presided. Governor Andrew, General Meade, General Devens and other distinguished soldiers spoke, and poems by Dr. Holmes and Mrs. Julia Ward Howe were read. The president of the day called on Mr. Emerson as representative of the poets and scholars whose thoughts had been an inspiration to Harvard's sons in the field. This was the mother of Robert Gould Shaw, who lost his life a few months later, leading his dusky soldiers up the slopes of Fort Wagner. It was in his honor that Mr. Emerson wrote in the Voluntaries. Stainless soldier on the walls. Knowing this, and knows no more. Whoever fights, whoever falls. Justice conquers evermore. Justice after as before. And he who battles on her side. God, though he were 10 times slain. Crowns him victor glorified. Victor over death and pain. Oh beautiful! My country! Ours once more! What words divine of lover or of poet could tell our love and make thee know it? Among the nations bright beyond compare. What were our lives without thee? What all our lives to save thee? We reck not what we gave thee. We will not dare to doubt thee. But ask whatever else, and we will dare. Lowell, Commemoration Ode. Address at the dedication of the Soldiers' Monument in Concord. In 1836. The Battle Monument, to commemorate the first organized resistance to British aggression, had been erected, in gratitude to God and love of freedom, on the spot where the first of the enemy fell in the war which gave independence to the United States. 33 years later, on the 19th day of April, with its threefold patriotic memories for Concord, the people gathered on the village common to see their new memorial to valor. The inscription on one of its bronze tablets declared that the town of Concord builds this monument in honor of the brave men whose names it bears, and records with grateful pride that they found here a birthplace, home or grave. The inscription on the other tablet is the single sentence. They died for their country. In the War of the Rebellion. With the 44 names. Honorable John S. Keyes as President of the Day opened the ceremonies with a short address. The Rev. Grindle Reynolds made the prayer. An ode written by Mr. George B. Bartlett was sung to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. Honorable Ebenezer Rockwood Hoare, the chairman of the Monument Committee, read the report, in itself an eloquent and moving speech. This was followed by Mr. Emerson's address. Mr. F. B. Sanborn contributed a poem, and afterwards short speeches were made by Senator George S. Boutwell, William Schuller, the efficient Adjutant General of the state, and by Colonels Parker and Marsh respectively of the 32nd and 47th Regiments of Massachusetts Volunteers, in which the Concord companies had served. The exercises were concluded by the reading of a poem by Mr. Sampson Mason, an aged citizen of the town. It was a beautiful spring day. The throng was too large for the town hall, so, partly sheltered from the afternoon sun by the town elm, thickening with its brown buds, they gathered around the townhouse steps, which served as platform for the speakers. Compare, in the poems, the lines in The Problem on the adoption by nature of man's devotional structures. Great men in the Senate sate, sage and hero, side by side, building for their sons the state, which they shall rule with pride. They forbore to break the chain, which bound the dusky tribe, checked by the owner's fierce disdain, lured by union as the bribe. Destiny sat by, and said, pang for pang your seed shall pay. Hide in false peace your coward head. I bring round the harvest day. Wordsworth's Sonnet, No. 14, in Poems Dedicated to National Independence, Part 2. Mr. Emerson had in mind the astonishing fertility of resource in difficulties shown by the 8th Massachusetts Regiment in the march from Annapolis to Washington, as told by Major Theodore Winthrop in New York's 7th Regiment. Our March to Washington, Atlantic Monthly, June, 1861. See Resources, Letters and Social Aims, page 143. Judge Hoare in his report on this occasion said, 2 names, on the tablet, recall the unutterable horrors of Andersonville, and will never suffer us to forget that our armies conquered barbarism as well as treason. Between 1856 and 1859 John Brown and other Free State men, Mr. Whitman, Mr. Newt and Preacher Stewart, had told the sad story of Kansas to the Concord people and received important aid. This was Captain Charles E. Bowers, a shoemaker, and Mr. Emerson's next neighbor, much respected by him, whose forcible speaking at anti-slavery in Kansas aid meetings he often praised. When the war came, Mr. Bowers, though father of a large family, and near the age limit of service, volunteered as a private in the 1st Company, went again as an officer in the 32nd Massachusetts Regiment, and served with credit in the Army of the Potomac until discharged for disability. George L. Prescott, a lumber dealer and farmer, later colonel of the 32nd Regiment, U.S.V. He was of the same stock as Colonel William Prescott, the hero of Bunker Hill. Judge Hoare said of him, an only son, an only brother, a husband and a father, with no sufficient provision made for his wife and children, he had everything to make life dear and desirable, and to require others to hesitate for him. But he did not hesitate himself. Blaise de Montluc, a Gascon officer of remarkable valor, skill and fidelity, under Francis I, and several succeeding kings of France. It was well said by Judge Hoare, his instinctive sympathies taught him from the outset, what many higher in command were so slow and so late to learn, that it is the first duty of an officer to take care of his men as much as to lead them. His character developed new and larger proportions, with new duties and larger responsibilities. The Buttricks were among the original settlers of Concord, and the family has given good account of itself for nearly 270 years. And still owns the farm on the hill whence Major John led the yeomen of Middlesex down to force the passage of the North Bridge. 7 representatives of that family of sturdy Democrats volunteered at the beginning of the War of the Rebellion. 2 were discharged as physically unfit, but the others served in Army or Navy with credit, and 2 of them lost their lives in the service. Alden Buttrick had fought the border ruffians in Kansas. Humphrey, a mason by trade, but a mighty hunter, left his wife and little children at the first call, and was first sergeant of Prescott's company. Mr. Emerson omits to state that he was commissioned lieutenant in the 47th Regiment the following year. His service, especially as captain in the 59th Regiment, was arduous and highly creditable. Edward O. Shepard, who had been master of the Concord High School, afterwards a successful lawyer, had an excellent war record, and rose to be lieutenant colonel of the 32nd Regiment. George Laureate left the gold beater's shop of Ephraim W. Bull, the producer of the Concord grape, to go to the war in Concord's first company. Modest and brave, he became an excellent officer and returned captain and brevet major of the 32nd Regiment. Francis Buttrick, younger brother of Humphrey, a handsome and attractive youth, had lived at Mr. Emerson's home to carry on the farm for him. These three were Asa, John and Samuel Melvin. Asa died of wounds received before Petersburg. Both his brothers of sickness, Samuel after long suffering in the prison pen at Andersonville. They came of an old family of hunter-farmers in Concord. Close by the wall next the street of the old hill burying ground is the stone in memory of one of their race, whose martial genius early engaged him in his country's cause under command of the valiant Captain Lovell in that hazardous enterprise where our hero, his commander, with many brave and valiant men bled and died. The writer of this letter, a quiet, handsome schoolboy the year before the war broke out, lived just across the brook behind Mr. Emerson's house. He was an excellent soldier in the 32nd Regiment, and re-enlisted as a veteran in 1864. Editor's address, Massachusetts Quarterly Review. Mr. Cabot, in his memoir, says that just before Mr. Emerson sailed for Europe in 1847, Theodore Parker, Drive S. G. Howe and others, Mr. Cabot was one of these, met to consider whether there could not be a new quarterly review which should be more alive than was the North American to the questions of the day. Charles Sumner and Thoreau are mentioned as having been present. Colonel Higginson says that Mr. Parker wished it to be the Dial with a beard. It was decided that the undertaking should be made. Mr. Parker wished Mr. Emerson to be editor, but he declined. A committee was chosen, Emerson, Parker and Howe, to draft a manifesto to the public. Mr. Emerson wrote the paper here printed, but when the first number of the review came to him in England, was annoyed at finding his name set down as one of the editors. I think that the only paper he ever wrote for it, beyond the address to the public, was a notice of some Oxford poetry, the recently published poems of John Sterling and Arthur Hugh Clough. Theodore Parker was the real editor. During its 3 years of life the Massachusetts Quarterly, now hard to obtain, was a brave, independent and patriotic magazine, and, like the Dial, gives the advancing thought of the time in literary and social matters. And also in religion and politics. Plutarch tells that Cinnas, the wise counselor of Pyrrhus, king of the Epirots, asked his monarch when he set forth to conquer Rome what he should do afterwards. Pyrrhus said he could then become master of Sicily. And then, asked Cinnas. The king told of further dreams of conquest of Carthage and Libya. But when we have conquered all that, what are we to do then? Why then, my friend, said Pyrrhus, laughing, we will take our ease, and drink and be merry. Cinnas, having brought him thus far, replied, and what hinders us from drinking and taking our ease now, when we have already those things in our hands at which we propose to arrive through seas of blood, through infinite toils and dangers? Innumerable calamities which we must both cause and suffer. To live without duties is obscene. Aristocracy, lectures, and biographical sketches. This was shortly after the annexation of Texas, and during the successful progress of the Mexican War. The slave power, although awakening opposition by its insatiable demands, was still on the increase. Charles Sumner, though a rising statesman, had not yet entered Congress. For destiny never swerves, nor yields to men the helm. The World Soul, Poems. Address to Kossuth. On a beautiful day in May, 1852, Louis Kossuth, the exiled governor of Hungary, who had come to this country to solicit her to interfere in European politics on behalf of his oppressed people, visited the towns of Lexington and Concord, and spoke to a large assemblage in each place. Kossuth was met at the Lexington line by a cavalcade from Concord, who escorted him to the village, where he received a cordial welcome. The town hall was crowded with people. The Honorable John S. Keyes presided, and Mr. Emerson made the address of welcome. Kossuth, in his earnest appeal for American help, addressed Mr. Emerson personally in the following passages, after alluding to Concord's part in the struggle for freedom in 1775. It is strange, indeed, how every incident of the present bears the mark of a deeper meaning around me. There is meaning in the very fact that it is you, sir, by whom the representative of Hungary's ill-fated struggle is so generously welcomed, to the shrine of martyrs illumined by victory. You are wont to dive into the mysteries of truth and disclose mysteries of right to the eyes of men. Your honored name is Emerson. And Emerson was the name of a man who, a minister of the gospel, turned out with his people, on the 19th of April of eternal memory, when the alarm bell first was rung. I take hold of that augury, sir. Religion and philosophy, you blessed twins, upon you I rely with my hopes to America. Religion, the philosophy of the heart, will make the Americans generous, and philosophy, the religion of the mind, will make the Americans wise. And all that I claim is a generous wisdom and a wise generosity. I am unable to find the source of these lines. For the power of minorities, see, Progress of Culture, Letters and Social Aims, pp. 216 to 219, and, Considerations by the Way, Conduct of Life, pages 248, 249. Woman. Perhaps the pleasantest word Mr. Emerson ever spoke about women was what he said at the end of the war: everybody has been wrong in his guess except good women, who never despair of an ideal right. Mr. Emerson's habitual treatment of women showed his real feeling towards them. He held them to their ideal selves by his courtesy and honor. When they called him to come to their aid, he came. Men must not deny them any right that they desired. Though he never felt that the finest women would care to assume political functions in the same way that men did. Mr. Cabot gives in his memoir, page 455, a letter which Mr. Emerson wrote, 5 years before this speech was made, to a lady who asked him to join in a call for a woman's suffrage convention. His distaste for the scheme clearly appears, and though perhaps felt in a less degree as time went on, never quite disappeared. At the end of the notes on this address is given the greater part of a short speech which he wrote many years later, but which he seems never to have delivered. Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson is reported in the Woman's Journal as having said at the New England Women's Club, May 16, 1903, that Mr. Cabot put into his memoir what Mr. Emerson said in his early days, when he was opposed to woman suffrage, the letter above alluded to, and left out all those warm and cordial sentences that he wrote later in regard to it, culminating in his assertion that whatever might be said of it as an abstract question, all his measures would be carried sooner if women could vote. This last assertion, though not in the memoir, Mr. Cabot printed in its place in the present address, and the only other address on the subject which is known to exist, Mr. Cabot did not print probably because Mr. Emerson never delivered it. This passage from the original is omitted. A woman of genius said, "I will forgive you that you do so much, and you me that I do nothing." This sentence originally ended, and their convention should be holden in a sculpture gallery. From The Angel in the House, by Coventry Patmore. Milton, Paradise Lost. Because of the high triumph of humility, his favorite virtue, Mr. Emerson, though commonly impatient of sad stories, had always a love for the story of Griselda, as told by Chaucer, alluded to below. In spite of its great length, he would not deny it a place in his collection Parnassus. From Love and Humility, by Henry Moore, 1614–87. These anecdotes followed in the original speech. I use the Lord of the Kaaba. What is the Kaaba to me, said Rabia. I am so near to God that his word, whoso nears me by a span, to him come I a mile, is true for me. A famed Mahometan theologian asked her, how she had lifted herself to this degree of the love of God. She replied, hereby, that all things which I had found, I have lost in him. The other said, in what way or method hast thou known him? She replied, O Hassan! Thou knowest him after a certain art and way, but I without art and way. When once she was sick, 3 famed theologians came to her, Hassan Basri, Malek and Balchi. Hassan said, "He is not upright in his prayer who does not endure the blows of his Lord." Balchi said, "He is not upright in his prayer who does not rejoice in the blows of his Lord." But Rabia, who in these words detected some trace of egoism, said, "He is not upright in his prayer, who, when he beholds his Lord, forgets not that he is stricken." See, Clubs, in Society in Solitude, page 243. The Princess is the poem alluded to. Mr. Emerson liked it, but used to say it was sad to hear it end with, "Go home and mind your mending." The internal evidence shows that the short speech given below was written after the war. All that is important is here given. There were one or two paragraphs that essentially were the same as those of the 1855 address. On the manuscript is written, apparently in Mr. Emerson's hand, in pencil, never read, and evidently in his hand, the title, thus. Discours Woman. I consider that the movement which unites us today is no whim, but an organic impulse, a right and proper inquiry, honoring to the age. And among the good signs of the times, this is of the best. The distinctions of the mind of woman we all recognize, their affectionate, sympathetic, religious, oracular nature, their swifter and finer perception. Their taste, or love of order and beauty, influencing or creating manners. We commonly say, man represents intellect, and woman, love. Man looks for hard truth. Woman, with her affection for goodness, benefit. Hence they are religious. In all countries and creeds the temples are filled by women, and they hold men to religious rites and moral duties. And in all countries the man, no matter how hardened a reprobate he is, likes well to have his wife a saint. It was no historic chance, but an instinct, which softened in the Middle Ages the terror of the superstitious, by gradually lifting their prayers to the Virgin Mary and so adopting the Mother of God as the efficient intercessor. And now, when our religious traditions are so far outgrown as to require correction and reform, 'tis certain that nothing can be fixed and accepted which does not commend itself to woman. I suppose women feel in relation to men as 'tis said geniuses feel among energetic workers, that, though overlooked and thrust aside in the press, they outsee all these noisy masters, and we, in the presence of sensible women, feel overlooked, judged, and sentenced. They are better scholars than we at school, and the reason why they are not better than we 20 years later may be because men can turn their reading to account in the professions, and women are excluded from the professions. These traits have always characterized women. We are a little vain of our women, as if we had invented them. I think we exaggerate the effect of Greek, Roman and even Oriental institutions on the character of woman. Superior women are rare anywhere, as superior men are. But the anecdotes of every country give like portraits of womanhood, and every country in its roll of honor has as many women as men. The high sentiment of women appears in the Hebrew, the Hindu, in Greek women in Homer, in the tragedies, and Roman women in the histories. Their distinctive traits, grace, vivacity, and sure moral sentiment, their self-sacrifice, their courage and endurance, have in every nation found respect and admiration. Her gifts make woman the refiner and civilizer of her mate. Civilization is her work. Man is rude and bearish in colleges, in mines, in ships, because there is no woman. Let good women go passengers in the ship, and the manners at once are mended. In schools, in hospitals, in the prairie, in California, she brings the same reform. Her activity in putting an end to slavery, and in serving the hospitals of the Sanitary Commission in the war, and in the labors of the Freedmen's Bureau, have opened her eyes to larger rights and duties. She claims now her full rights of all kinds, to education, to employment, to equal laws of property. Well, now in this country we are suffering much and fearing more from the abuse of the ballot and from fraudulent and purchased votes. And now, at the moment when committees are investigating and reporting the election frauds, woman asks for her vote. It is the remedy at the hour of need. She is to purify and civilize the voting, as she has the schools, the hospitals, and the drawing rooms. For, to grant her request, you must remove the polls from the tavern and rum shop, and build noble edifices worthy of the state, whose halls shall afford her every security for deliberate and sovereign action. 'Tis certainly no new thing to see women interest themselves in politics. In England, in France, in Germany, Italy, we find women of influence and administrative capacity, some Duchess of Marlborough, some Madame de Longueville, Madame Roland, centers of political power and intrigue. But we have ourselves seen the great political enterprise of our times, the abolition of slavery in America, undertaken by a society whose executive committee was composed of men and women, and which held together until this object was attained. And she may well exhibit the history of that as her voucher that she is entitled to demand power which she has shown she can use so well. 'Tis idle to refuse them a vote on the ground of incompetency. I wish our masculine voting were so good that we had any right to doubt their equal discretion. They could not easily give worse votes, I think, than we do. Consecration of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Within a quarter of a mile of Concord Common was a natural amphitheater, carpeted in late summer with a purple bloom of wild grass, and girt by a horseshoe-shaped glacial moraine clothed with noble pines and oaks. It was part of Deacon Brown's farm, and reached by a lane, with a few houses on it, cut through a low part of the ridge of hills which sheltered the old town. When the deacon died, the town laid out a new road to Bedford, cutting off this Sleepy Hollow, as the townspeople who enjoyed strolling there had named it, from the rest of the farm. Mr. John S. Keyes saw the fitness of the ground for a beautiful cemetery, and induced the town to buy it for that purpose, and as chairman of the committee, laid out the land. The people of the village, for Concord had nothing suburban about it then, gathered there one beautiful September afternoon to choose their resting places and consecrate the ground. Mr. Emerson made the address on the slope just below the place where, beneath a great pine, the tree he loved best, he had chosen the spot for his own grave. Much of his essay on immortality was originally a part of this discourse, and therefore that portion is omitted here, its place in the essay being indicated. Robert Burns. It is pleasant to be able to let Dr. Holmes, who was present at the Burns Festival, speak for himself and Lowell and Judge Hoare of Mr. Emerson's speech on that day. I have heard the judge tell the story of his friend's success with the same delight. On the 25th of January, 1859, Emerson attended the Burns Festival, held at the Parker House in Boston, on the centennial anniversary of the poet's birth. He spoke, after the dinner, to the great audience with such beauty and eloquence that all who listened to him have remembered it as one of the most delightful addresses they ever heard. Among his hearers was Mr. Lowell, who says of it that every word seemed to have just dropped down to him from the clouds. Judge Hoare, who was another of his hearers, says that, though he has heard many of the chief orators of his time, he never witnessed such an effect of speech upon men. I was myself present on that occasion, and underwent the same fascination that these gentlemen and the varied audience before the speaker experienced. His words had a passion in them not usual in the calm, pure flow most natural to his uttered thoughts. White-hot iron we are familiar with, but white-hot silver is what we do not often look upon, and his inspiring address glowed like silver fresh from the cupel. The strange part of all the accounts given by the hearers is that Mr. Emerson seemed to speak extempore, which can hardly have been so. No account of the festival, or Mr. Emerson's part therein, appears in the journals, except a short page of praise of the felicitous anecdotes introduced by other after-dinner speakers. Here comes out that respect for labor which affected all Mr. Emerson's relations to the humblest people he met. In the appendix to the poems it appears in the verses beginning, "Said Sadi, when I stood before Hassan the camel driver's door." Thomas Carlyle. Mr. Emerson here recalls his childhood and that of his brothers, as in the passage in Domestic Life, in Society in Solitude, that has been often referred to in these notes. Among some stray lecture sheets was the following on the scholar or poet. Given the insight, and he will find as many beauties and heroes and strokes of genius close by him as Dante or Shakespeare beheld. It was in a cold moor farm, in a dingy country inn, that Burns found his fancy so sprightly. You find the times and places mean. Stretch a few threads over an Aeolian harp, and put it in the window and listen to what it says of the times and of the heart of nature. You shall not believe the miracle of nature is less, the chemical power worn out. Watch the breaking morning, or the enchantments of the sunset. Shakespeare. The following notes on Shakespeare were written by Mr. Emerson for the celebration in Boston by the Saturday Club of the 300th anniversary of the poet's birth. In Mr. Cabot's Memoir of Emerson, Volume 2, page 621, apropos of Mr. Emerson's avoidance of impromptu speech on public occasions, is this statement. I remember his getting up at a dinner of the Saturday Club on the Shakespeare anniversary in 1864, to which some guests had been invited. Looking about him tranquilly for a minute or two, and then sitting down. Serene and unabashed, but unable to say a word upon a subject so familiar to his thoughts from boyhood. Yet on the manuscript of this address Mr. Emerson noted that it was read at the club's celebration on that occasion, and at the Revere House. Parker's was the usual gathering place of the club. The handwriting of this note shows that Mr. Emerson wrote it in his later years, so it is very possible that Mr. Cabot was right. Mr. Emerson perhaps forgot to bring his notes with him to the dinner, and so did not venture to speak. And the dinner may have been at Parker's. Alexander von Humboldt. The Boston Society of Natural History celebrated the 100th anniversary of the birth of Humboldt. Dr. Robert C. Waterston presided at the music hall, where Agassiz made the address. In the evening there was a reception in Horticultural Hall. The occasion was made memorable by the Society by the founding of a Humboldt and Agassiz scholarship in the Museum of Comparative Zoology in Cambridge. Poems by Dr. Holmes and Mrs. Howe were read. Professor E. J. Young and Dr. Charles T. Jackson gave reminiscences of Humboldt. Colonel Higginson, the Reverend Dr. Hedge and others spoke. Mr. Emerson's remarks are taken from an abstract given in the account of the celebration published by the Society. Walter Scott. Although Mr. Emerson, in the period between 1838 and 1848 especially, when considering the higher powers of poetry, spoke slightingly of Scott, in the Dial papers as objective, and the poet of society, of patrician and conventional Europe. Or in English traits as a writer of A Rhyme Traveller's Guide to Scotland, he had always honor for the noble man, and affectionate remembrance for the poems as well as the novels. In the poem, The Harp, when enumerating poets, he calls Scott, the delight of generous boys, but the generosus pure was his own delight, the hope of the generation lay in him, and his own best audience was made up of such. In the essay, Illusions, he says that the boy has no better friend than Scott, Shakespeare, Plutarch and Homer. The man lives to other objects, but who dare affirm that they are more real? In the essay, Aristocracy, he names among the claims of a superior class, genius, the power to affect the imagination, and presently speaks of those who think and paint and laugh and weep in their eloquent closets. And then convert the world into a huge whispering gallery, to report the tale to all men and win smiles and tears from many generations, and give Scott and Burns among the high company whom he instances. Mr. Emerson's children can testify how with regard to Scott he always was ready to become a boy again. As we walked in the woods, he would show us the cellar holes of the Irish colony that came to Concord to build the railroad, and he named these deserted villages Derncleugh and Ellangowan. The sight recalled Meg Merrilies' pathetic lament to the laird at the eviction of the gypsies, which he would then recite. Alice Brand, the Sair Field o' Harlaw, which old Elspeth sings to the children in the antiquary, and Helvellyn, were again and again repeated to us with pleasure on both sides. With special affection in later years when we walked in Walden Woods he would croon the lines from The Dying Bard. Dinah's Emlyn, lament, for the moment is nigh. When mute in the woodlands thine echoes shall die. Perhaps he had foreboding for his loved woods, beginning to be desecrated with rude city picnics, and since burned over repeatedly by the fires from the railroad. When half of their charms with Cadwallon shall die. Of this poem he wrote in the Journal of 1845. Dinah's Emlyn of Scott, like his Helvellyn, shows how near to a poet he was. All the Birmingham part he had, and what taste and sense. yet never rose into the creative region. As a practitioner or professional poet he is unrivaled in modern times. Yet he immediately adds, in lectures on poetry almost all Scott would be to be produced. Mr. Emerson took a special pleasure in the passage in The Lord of the Isles where the old abbot, rising to denounce excommunicated Bruce to his foes, is inspired against his will to bless him and prophesy his triumph as Scotland's deliverer. Mr. Emerson, writing in his journal in 1842 of his impatience of superficial city life, during a visit to New York, alludes to the renewed comfort he had in The Lord of the Isles. Life goes headlong. Each of us is always to be found hurrying headlong in the chase of some fact, hunted by some fear or command behind us. Suddenly we meet a friend. We pause. Our hurry and empressement look ridiculous. When I read The Lord of the Isles last week at Staten Island, and when I meet my friend, I have the same feeling of shame at having allowed myself to be a mere huntsman and follower. His boyish love for the lay of the last minstrel remained through life. As we walked on Sunday afternoons he recited to his children the stanzas about the custom of Branksome Hall, and the passage where the Lady of Branksome defies the spirits of the flood and fell. And the bleak mile of road between Walden Woods and home would often call out from him. The way was long, the wind was cold. The minstrel was infirm and old, etc. The Bride of Lammermoor was the only dreary tale that Mr. Emerson could abide, except Griselda. Journal, 1856. Eugene Sue, Dumas, etc., when they begin a story, do not know how it will end, but Walter Scott, when he began The Bride of Lammermoor, had no choice, nor Shakespeare, nor Macbeth. Journal. We talked of Scott. There is some greatness in defying posterity and writing for the hour. Speech at the banquet in honor of the Chinese embassy. When the Chinese embassy visited Boston in the summer of 1868 a banquet was given them at the St. James Hotel, on August 21. The young Emerson, sounding an early note of independence of the past, had written in 1824. I laugh at those who, while they gape and gaze, the bald antiquity of China praise. But later he learned to revere the wisdom of Asia. About the time when the Dial appeared, many sentences of Chinese wisdom are found in his journal, and also in the magazine among the ethnical scriptures. Remarks at the organization of the Free Religious Association. In the spring of 1867, a call for a public meeting was issued by Octavius B. Frothingham, William J. Potter and Roland Connor, to consider the conditions, wants and progress of free religion in America. The response was so large as to surprise the committee, and Horticultural Hall was completely filled on May 30. Reverend Octavius B. Frothingham presided. The committee had invited as speakers the Reverend H. Blanchard of Brooklyn from the Universalists, Lucretia Mott from the Society of Friends, Robert Dale Owen from the Spiritualists, the Rev. John Weiss from the left wing of the Unitarians, Oliver Johnson from the Progressive Friends, Francis E. Abbott, editor of the Index, and also David Wasson, Colonel T. W. Higginson and Mr. Emerson. The meeting was very successful and the Free Religious Association was founded. Mr. Emerson's genial and affirmative attitude at this meeting was helpful and important. He wished the new movement to be neither aggressive towards the beliefs of others, nor merely a religion of works, purely beneficently utilitarian. Doubtless there were many young and active radicals strong for destructive criticism. Mr. Emerson wished to see that in their zeal to destroy the dry husk of religion they should not bruise the white flower within. His counsel to young men was, omit all negative propositions. It will save 99/100ths of your labor, and increase the value of your work in the same measure. In the Journal of 1837 he said, why rake up old manuscripts to find therein a man's soul? You do not look for conversation in a corpse. And elsewhere, in religion the sentiment is all, the ritual or ceremony indifferent. Speech at the second annual meeting of the Free Religious Association. Mrs. Julia Ward Howe writes of Mr. Emerson. He knew from the first the victory of good over evil. And when he told me, to my childish amazement, that the angel must always be stronger than the demon, he gave utterance to a thought most familiar to him, though at the time new to me. In the essay on character, lectures and biographical sketches, he says, the establishment of Christianity in the world does not rest on any miracle but the miracle of being the broadest and most humane doctrine. The word miracle, as pronounced by Christian churches, gives a false impression. It is monster. It is not one with the blowing clover and the falling rain. Address in Divinity College, Nature, Addresses and Lectures. Mr. Emerson's doctrine was not to attack beliefs, but give better. True genius will not impoverish, but will liberate. In a letter to one of his best friends who had joined the Church of Rome he said, perhaps in 1858, to old eyes how supremely unimportant the form under which we celebrate the justice, love and truth, the attributes of the deity and the soul. Dr. Holmes, in his tribute to his friend, after his death, read before the Massachusetts Historical Society, said, "What could we do with this unexpected, unprovided for, unclassified, half unwelcome newcomer, who had been for a while potted, as it were, in our Unitarian cold greenhouse, but had taken to growing so fast that he was lifting off its glass roof and letting in the hailstorms?" Here was a protest that outflanked the extreme left of liberalism, yet so calm and serene that its radicalism had the accents of the gospel of peace. Here was an iconoclast without a hammer, who took down our idols from their pedestals so tenderly that it seemed like an act of worship. Address at the opening of the Concord Free Public Library. The town of Concord, in the year 1782, chose a committee of 10 leading citizens to give instructions to its selectmen. The third of the 17 articles proposed by them read thus, that care be taken of the books of Martas and other books, and that they be kept from abusive usage, and not lent to persons more than 1 month at one time. This indicates the root of a town library. A constitution of a library company, dated 1784, is extant. In 1806 a social library was incorporated, which was merged in the town library in 1851. The books were kept in a room in the town house which was open for borrowers on Saturdays. William Monroe, son of a Concord tradesman who vied with the Thoreaus in the manufacture of lead pencils, after leaving the Concord schools went into business, and later into the manufacture of silk. His intelligence and force of character secured prosperity. He loved Concord, and, to use his own words, desired to testify my regard to my native town by doing something to promote the education and intelligence, and thus the welfare and prosperity of its people. He gave to Concord a lot of land in the heart of the town and a building for a free public library, which, with great care and thoroughness, he had built thereon and duly furnished, and made handsome provision for care of the land and the extension of the building later. He added a generous gift for books of reference and standard works. The town thankfully accepted the gift, placed their books in it, and chose their library committee. On a fine autumn day in 1873, the library was opened with public ceremonies. Mr. Monroe in a short and modest speech explained his purpose. Mr. H.F. Smith, on behalf of the new library committee, reported its action and the gifts which had poured in. Judge Hoare received the property on behalf of the Board of Corporation, and Mr. Emerson, but lately returned with improved health from his journey to the Nile, made the short address. Writing was now very difficult for him, but the occasion pleased and moved him, and his notes on books and on Concord, and the remembrance of his friends the Concord authors but lately gone, served him, and the day passed off well. The Gospel Covenant, printed in London in 1646, and quoted by Mr. Emerson in the Historical Discourse. Major Simon Willard, a Kentish merchant, was Peter Bulkeley's strong coadjutor in the founding of Concord. He also is alluded to in the Historical Discourse. These extracts are from the diary of Miss Mary Moody Emerson. This letter was written not long after the death of John Thoreau, Henry's dearly loved brother, and also of little Waldo Emerson, to whom he became greatly attached while he was a member of Mr. Emerson's household. Mr. Emerson here speaks for others. He could not read Hawthorne because of the gloom of his magic mirror, but the man interested and attracted him, though even as neighbors they seldom met. Mr. Emerson notes that this is an allusion to the Harmonies of Ptolemy. The Fortune of the Republic. In 1863, during the dark days of the Civil War, before the tide had fully turned in the field, while disaffection showed itself in the North, and England and France threatened intervention, Mr. Emerson gave a hopeful lecture, the basis of the present discourse, on the fortune of the Republic. After the war it was adapted to the new and happier conditions. On the 30th of March, 1878, 6 years after Mr. Emerson had withdrawn from literary work, and but 4 years before his death, he was induced to read the lecture in the Old South Church, in a course planned by the committee, to save the venerable building. The church was filled, Mr. Emerson's delivery was good, and he seemed to enjoy the occasion. It was probably his last speech in public, and so fitly closes the volume. This passage occurred in the early lecture. It is the distinction of man to think, and all the few men who, since the beginning of the world, have done anything for us were men who did not follow the river, or ship the cotton, or pack the pork. But who thought for themselves. What the country wants is personalities, grand persons, to counteract its materialities, for it is the rule of the universe that corn shall serve man, and not man, corn. Here followed, what we call Kentucky, or Vallandigham, or Fernando Wood is really the ignorance and nonsense in us, stolid stupidity which gives the strength to those names. It is our own vice which takes form, or gives terror with which these persons affect us. This refers to a young Massachusetts scholar, of promise and beauty, whom Mr. Emerson had been pleased with, as a fellow voyager. He soon was corrupted by politics. Coming up, at a reception, to shake hands with Mr. Emerson he was thus greeted, "If what I hear of your recent action be true, I must shake hands with you under protest." Soon after, this aspirant for power attended the dinner given to Brooks after his cowardly assault on Sumner. But the moment the Emancipation Proclamation had been approved by the people, he became an ornamental figurehead at Republican and Reform gatherings. From the last scene of Cynthia's Revels, by Ben Jonson. The one serious and formidable thing in nature is a will. Fate, Conduct of Life, page 30. See also Aristocracy, in Lectures and Biographical Sketches, page 50. Ben Jonson, The Golden Age Restored. She spawneth men as mallows fresh. Nature, 2, Poems. See also the Song of Nature, in the Poems. In the earlier lecture was this passage. The roots of our success are in our poverty, our Calvinism, our thrifty habitual industry, in our snow and east wind, and farm life and sea life. There is in this country this immense difference from Europe, that, whereas all their systems of government and society are historical, our politics are almost ideal. We wish to treat man as man, without regard to rank, wealth, race, color, or caste, simply as human souls. We lie near to nature, we are pensioners on nature, draw on inexhaustible resources, and we interfere the least possible with individual freedom. In the Historical Discourse, in this volume, Mr. Emerson tells of the evolution of the town meeting of New England and its working excellence, and of the latter also in Social Aims, and Eloquence, in Letters and Social Aims. For you can teach the lightning speech. And round the globe your voices reach. Boston, Poems. I will divide my goods. Call in the wretch and slave. None shall rule but the humble. And none but toil shall have. Boston Hymn, Poems. The following passages came from the earlier lecture. I must be permitted to read a quotation from de Tocqueville, whose censure is more valuable. As it comes from one obviously very partial to the American character and institutions. I know no country in which there is so little true independence of opinion and freedom of discussion as in America, Volume I, page 259. I am far from thinking it late. I don't despond at all whilst I hear the verdicts of European juries against us. Renan says this, Arnold says that. That does not touch us. 'Tis doubtful whether London, whether Paris can answer the questions which now rise in the human mind. But the humanity of all nations is now in the American Union. Europe, England is historical still. Our politics, our social frame are almost ideal. We have got suppled into a state of melioration. When I see the emigrants landing at New York, I say, there they go, to school. In estimating nations, potentiality must be considered as well as power, not what today's actual performance is, but what promise is in the mind which a crisis will bring out. The war has established a chronic hope, for a chronic despair. It is not a question whether we shall be a nation, or only a multitude of people. No, that has been conspicuously decided already. But whether we shall be the new nation, guide and lawgiver of all nations, as having clearly chosen and firmly held the simplest and best rule of political society. Culture, be sure, is in some sort the very enemy of nationality and makes us citizens of the world, and yet it is essential that it should have the flavor of the soil in which it grew, and combine this with universal sympathies. Thus in this country are new traits and distinctions not known to former history. Colonies of an old country, but in new and commanding conditions. Colonies of a small and crowded island, but planted on a continent and therefore working it in small settlements, where each man must count for 10, and is put to his mettle to come up to the need. Pray leave these English to form their opinions. 'Tis a matter of absolute insignificance what those opinions are. They will fast enough run to change and retract them on their knees when they know who you are. I turn with pleasure to the good omen in the distinguished reception given in London to Mr. Beecher. It was already prepared by the advocacy of Cobden, Bright and Forster, Mill, Newman, Cairns and Hughes. And by the intelligent Americans already sent to England by our government to communicate with intelligent men in the English government and out of it. But Mr. Beecher owed his welcome to himself. He fought his way to his reward. It is one of the memorable exhibitions of the force of eloquence, his evening at Exeter Hall. The consciousness of power shown in his broad good sense, in his jocular humor and entire presence of mind, the surrender of the English audience on recognizing the true master. He steers the behemoth, sits astride him, strokes his fur, tickles his ear, and rides where he will. And I like the well-timed compliment there paid to our fellow citizen when the stormy audience reminds him to tell England that Wendell Phillips is the first orator of the world. One orator had a right to speak of the other, Byron's thunderstorm, where Jura answers from his misty shroud. Back to the joyous Alps who call to him aloud. The young men in America today take little thought of what men in England are thinking or doing. That is the point which decides the welfare of a people. Which way does it look? If to any other people, it is not well with them. If occupied in its own affairs, and thoughts, and men, with a heat which excludes almost the notice of any other people, as the Jews, as the Greeks, as the Persians, as the Romans, the Arabians, the French, the English. At their best times have done, they are sublime. And we know that in this abstraction they are executing excellent work. Amidst the calamities that war has brought on our country, this one benefit has accrued, that our eyes are withdrawn from England, withdrawn from France, and look homeward. We have come to feel that by ourselves our safety must be bought. To know the vast resources of the continent, the goodwill that is in the people. Their conviction of the great moral advantages of freedom, social equality, education and religious culture, and their determination to hold these fast, and by these hold fast the country. And penetrate every square inch of it with this American civilization. Americans, not girded by the iron belt of condition, not taught by society and institutions to magnify trifles, not victims of technical logic, but docile to the logic of events, not, like English, worshippers of fate. With no hereditary upper house, but with legal, popular assemblies, which constitute a perpetual insurrection, and by making it perpetual save us from revolutions. Footnotes. Mr. Emerson believed that "not" had been accidentally omitted, and it can hardly be questioned that he was right in his supposition. Volume 2, pages 424 to 433. The Genius and Character of Emerson. Lectures at the Concord School of Philosophy, edited by F. B. Sanborn. Boston, James R. Osgood and Company, 1885. Correspondence of Carlyle and Emerson, Volume 1, pages 260, 261. Epistle of Paul to Philemon, I, 16, 17. See the report of this speech in Redpath's Life of Captain John Brown. Boston, Thayer and Eldridge, 1860. Review of Holmes's Life of Emerson, North American Review, February, 1885. Richard Henry Dana, A Biography. By Charles Francis Adams. Houghton, Mifflin and Company, 1890. In Chapter 8 of this book is a very remarkable account of John Brown and his family at their home at North Elba in 1849, when Mr. Dana and a friend, lost in the Adirondack woods, chanced to come out upon the Brown clearing and were kindly received and aided. While waiting for the services to begin, Mr. Sears wrote some verses. The following lines, which Mrs. Emerson saw him write, were a prophecy literally fulfilled within 3 years by the Union armies singing the John Brown song. But not a pit 6 feet by 2 can hold a man like thee. John Brown shall tramp the shaking earth from Blue Ridge to the sea. In the very interesting work The Influence of Emerson, published in Boston in 1903, by the American Unitarian Association. See of the Historical Discourse. Emerson's Relation to Society, in The Genius and Character of Emerson, Lectures at the Concord School of Philosophy, edited by F. B. Sanborn. Boston, J. R. Osgood and Company, 1885.